Hey night traveler, welcome to the Stealth Podcast. Here, you'll hear chilling stories to help you drift to sleep or keep you awake. Before we start, drop a comment telling me what time you're tuning in and where you're listening from. Now, kill the lights, put your headphones on, and let's hit the road. My name is Diane Roswell. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Little Rock, Arkansas. I've been doing this van life thing for about 3 years now, ever since my divorce finalized and I realized I had no real reason to stay put anywhere. My daughter Emma's off at college in Colorado, and honestly, the empty house was driving me nuts. So I sold most of my stuff, bought a 2018 Sprinter van, converted it myself, well, with a lot of YouTube tutorials, and hit the road with my camera gear. I make decent money shooting abandoned places for urban exploration blogs and sometimes selling prints online. It's not glamorous, but it's mine, you know? I've been planning this Texarkana trip for months. See, I'm kind of obsessed with true crime history, and the Phantom Killer case from 1946 is one of those scary mysteries that never got solved. This hooded maniac attacked couples parked in lovers' lanes around town, killed 5 people in brutal ways, and then just vanished. No one ever caught him. The case inspired that movie, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. But the real story? Way more disturbing than any film could capture. I wanted to photograph some of the actual locations, Spring Lake Park where it all started, maybe some of the old downtown areas. My plan was to park somewhere discreet near the park, spend the night, and get those moody sunrise shots that my followers love. I rolled into Texarkana around 7 in the evening, right as the sun was starting to drop. It's this weird town that literally straddles the Texas-Arkansas border. Half the city's in one state, half in the other. There's even a post office that sits directly on the state line, which is pretty cool if you're into that kind of thing. But driving through, I got this heavy feeling in my chest. Maybe it was just knowing what happened here, or maybe it was the way the town felt sort of stuck in time, like it never fully moved past 1946. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet for a Friday evening. I passed a few locals at a gas station who gave me these long stares when I pulled up in my van. Not friendly, not hostile, just watching. I grabbed some provisions from a Walmart on the outskirts, water, some protein bars, a rotisserie chicken because I'm fancy like that, and headed toward the old Spring Lake Park area. Now, the park itself is mostly abandoned these days. After the murders, people stopped going there, and it never really recovered its reputation. The city built new recreational areas elsewhere, and Spring Lake just faded. There are still some trails and the remnants of the old pavilion, but it's overgrown now, creepy as hell even in daylight. I found a spot about a quarter mile from the park entrance, down this dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen traffic in years. Perfect for stealth camping, hidden by trees, no streetlights, no houses nearby. I backed the van into position so my side door faced away from the road, just in case anyone did drive by. The van's got blackout curtains on all the windows, solar panels on top, and I'd installed this neat little ventilation system that keeps air flowing without making noise. Inside, it's cozy, my bed platform in the back, a small kitchenette, storage underneath. I've got fairy lights strung up for ambience, though I usually keep them off when I'm parked somewhere sketchy. I made myself a quick dinner, scrolled through my research notes on my laptop about the Phantom murders. There was something about reading those old newspaper accounts that gave me chills. The victims' names: Betty Jo Booker, Paul Martin, Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Virgil Starks. Real people with real families who never got justice. Around 9:30, I decided to do a little night photography before bed. I grabbed my Canon, threw on a hoodie because it was getting chilly, and stepped out of the van. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. I walked maybe 50 yards toward where I knew the old park entrance was, just to get a feel for the place. That's when I noticed something weird. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt near my van. Not mine. Someone had driven down this road recently, maybe even while I was inside cooking dinner. The tracks continued past my spot and disappeared into the darkness ahead. I felt this little twist in my stomach, that instinct that tells you something's off. But I told myself it was probably just locals using this as a shortcut or something. Still, I decided to cut my photo walk short and headed back to the van, locking both doors behind me. I tried to settle in for the night, but I couldn't shake this restless feeling. You know when you're camping somewhere new and every little sound seems amplified? It was like that, except worse. I changed into my sleep clothes, just an old t-shirt and sweatpants, and climbed into my bed platform. I'd left one window cracked for airflow, and through it I could hear the wind picking up, making the trees sway and creak. I pulled up a podcast on my phone, some true crime thing ironically, and tried to focus on that instead of the darkness pressing against my windows. But about 20 minutes in, I heard something that made me pause the episode. It was a car engine, distant but getting closer. The headlights swept across my curtains as the vehicle passed, moving slowly down the dirt road. Way too slow for someone just passing through. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to fade, but instead the engine noise stopped completely. Silence. Then a car door opened and closed, that distinctive thunk sound. My heart started hammering because whoever it was, they'd parked somewhere ahead of me on this dead-end road. I sat up in bed, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps, voices. But there was nothing, just the wind and my own pulse pounding in my ears. I told myself it was probably just another camper, or maybe teenagers looking for a place to hang out. Texarkana kids probably still came out here to scare themselves with phantom stories. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 10:47 p.m. I also noticed I had no cell signal, which wasn't surprising this far from town, but it made me feel even more isolated. I keep a can of bear spray and a tire iron under my bed for emergencies, and I'll admit I pulled them both out and set them next to me. Paranoid? Maybe. But being a woman alone in a van means you can't be too careful, especially in a place with this kind of history. I decided I'd give it 15 minutes, and if I didn't hear that car leave, I'd start my engine and get the hell out. But then I heard it. Footsteps on gravel, definitely human, definitely close. They were coming from the direction of wherever that car had parked, walking back toward my van. The footsteps stopped right outside. I'm not exaggerating. They stopped maybe 10 feet from my side door. I couldn't see anything through the blackout curtains, but I could feel someone standing there. It's this horrible, scary sensation when you know you're being watched, but you can't see who's doing it. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, praying whoever it was would just move on. The seconds stretched out like hours. Then I heard something that made my blood go cold, a low whistle, like someone trying to get a dog's attention. It came 3 times, each one slightly louder. Then the footsteps moved again, circling around to the back of my van. I heard them pause at my rear doors, and I swear I heard someone try the handle. It didn't open because I'd locked everything, but the rattling sound was unmistakable. That's when I made a decision that was probably stupid but felt necessary. I was going to look. I had to know what was out there. I crawled to the front of the van as quietly as I could and peeled back the corner of my windshield curtain just a fraction of an inch. The moon was bright enough that I could see the dirt road pretty clearly, and what I saw made absolutely no sense. There was a figure standing about 30 feet away, facing my van. But here's the disturbing part. They were wearing what looked like a hood over their head, like a cloth sack with eye holes cut out. Just like the descriptions of the Phantom Killer from 1946. My rational brain immediately started trying to explain it away. It's just some asshole trying to scare campers, some local kid who knows the history and thinks it's funny to dress up. But my gut was screaming at me to get out of there. I let the curtain fall and scrambled back to the driver's seat, keys already in my hand. I was done with this place. But when I looked through the windshield again, the figure was gone. Completely vanished, like they'd never been there at all. I scanned the entire area visible from my front windows. Nothing. Just empty road and dark trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I started the engine, and the headlights flooded the road ahead. That's when I saw it. Written in the dirt directly in front of my van, in letters big enough to read clearly, were 2 words, "Stay awake." The handwriting was messy, frantic, like someone had dragged their finger through the dirt really fast. I didn't wait around to figure out what it meant. I threw the van in drive and got the hell out of there. I drove straight back toward town, my hands still trembling on the wheel, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds like that hooded figure might somehow be chasing me. The dirt road felt longer going out than it had coming in, and when I finally hit the main highway, I actually let out this shaky laugh of relief. The whole thing felt unreal now that I had streetlights and civilization around me. I mean, what the hell had just happened? Someone obviously knew I was there and decided to mess with me. Probably figured out I was a tourist interested in the phantom stuff. Small towns love screwing with outsiders, right? But that message in the dirt, "Stay awake," that kept replaying in my head. and it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a warning. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop on the edge of Texarkana, parked under the brightest light I could find, and just sat there trying to calm down. There were a few big rigs idling nearby, and seeing other people around made me feel somewhat safer. I thought about just driving straight back to Little Rock, calling this whole trip a loss, but that felt like defeat. Plus, I'd driven 6 hours to get here, and I hadn't gotten a single usable photo. I grabbed my laptop and started digging deeper into the Phantom case, looking for anything I might have missed. That's when I found something that made my skin crawl. In one of the original police reports from 1946, there was a detail that most articles don't mention. Several witnesses reported seeing a figure in a white hood near Spring Lake Park in the weeks after the last murder, even though the attacks had stopped. Some people thought it was a ghost, others figured it was copycats trying to keep the fear alive. But here's the really disturbing part. I found this obscure blog post from 2019 written by a local historian named Gerald Hutchins. He'd interviewed elderly Texarkana residents who remembered the Phantom era, and one woman claimed her father had been a deputy back then. According to her, the police had a suspect they could never prove was guilty, a man named Earl Vance who worked at a textile mill and lived alone near Spring Lake. Vance supposedly told people he could see the victims sometimes at night, that they visited him. The cops thought he was just crazy or trying to get attention, but then Vance disappeared in 1947, just vanished without a trace. His house was found abandoned with all his belongings still inside, and no one ever saw him again. The woman said her father believed Vance might have been the Phantom, that maybe guilt drove him to run or do something worse to himself. I sat in that truck stop parking lot reading this stuff until almost 2 in the morning, and I'll be honest, I was pretty freaked out. But I'm also stubborn as hell, and the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that what happened at Spring Lake was just someone local playing games. Maybe they'd seen my van with Arkansas plates and decided to have some fun with the out-of-towner. The stay awake message was weird, sure, but it could have been meant as a general threat or even some kind of twisted advice, like, don't fall asleep out here alone. I decided I'd find a different spot to camp for the night, somewhere more populated, and in the morning I'd go back and get my photos in broad daylight. There was a Walmart about 3 miles away that allowed overnight parking, and that seemed like the safest bet. I drove over there and parked among a handful of other RVs and vans. The parking lot was well lit, there were security cameras visible, and I could see the Walmart was still open with employees inside. This was about as safe as stealth camping gets. I reset my bed area, double-checked all my locks, and finally lay down around 3 a.m. Sleep came hard, and when it did, it was full of these fragmented, scary dreams. I kept seeing that hooded figure standing in different locations, outside my old house in Little Rock, in my daughter's college dorm room, in the back of my van. And in every dream, they just stood there, not moving, not speaking, just watching. I woke up what felt like every 20 minutes, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. By the time the sun started coming up around 6:30, I'd maybe gotten 2 hours of actual rest. I made coffee using my little camping stove, trying to shake off the grogginess and the lingering dread from the night before. The morning light made everything feel more normal, less horrifying. I could see families loading groceries into their cars, someone walking their dog past the parking lot, just regular life happening. I checked my phone, still no messages from Emma, which was typical, but I had a few comments on my Instagram from followers asking about my Texarkana trip. I posted a vague story about interesting first night without going into details. I didn't want to sound crazy or paranoid. Around 8 o'clock, I decided I was going back to Spring Lake Park. I needed those photos, and more than that, I needed to prove to myself that last night was just some local asshole and nothing more. I'd go in daylight, stay in public areas, and be out before dark. Simple. The drive back felt different in the morning. Texarkana looked almost charming with the sun up. Old brick buildings downtown, local diners with their neon signs, people going about their Saturday routines. I stopped at a place called Randy's Diner for breakfast because I needed real food, not just protein bars and coffee. The waitress was this older woman, maybe in her 70s, with a name tag that said Jolene. She had that classic Southern hospitality thing going, calling everyone honey and sugar, but when I mentioned I was heading to Spring Lake Park to take photos, her smile kind of froze. She leaned in close and said, real quiet, "You be careful out there, honey." Some places hold on to their darkness, you know? That park ain't been right since '46, and anyone who's lived here long enough knows to stay away after sunset. I laughed it off, told her I'd only be there during the day, but she just shook her head and walked away. That interaction stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. I got to Spring Lake Park around 9:30, and in the daylight it looked completely different. Less menacing, more just sad and forgotten. The old entrance had a rusted metal arch that probably used to have a sign on it, and the parking area was cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through everywhere. I could see the remnants of what had been a nice recreational area, a pavilion with most of its roof caved in, some concrete picnic tables covered in graffiti, and trails leading off into overgrown woods. There were a couple of other cars in the lot, which surprised me. One was this beat-up Honda with a guy sitting in the driver's seat eating something, and the other was a silver pickup truck that was empty. At least I wasn't completely alone out here. I grabbed my camera bag and started walking the main trail, taking shots of the abandoned pavilion, the way morning light filtered through the trees, some close-ups of old beer cans and trash that gave it that desolate vibe my followers love. The place had this eerie stillness to it, even with birds chirping and squirrels doing their thing. I kept thinking about what happened here in 1946. Young couples just trying to have some privacy, enjoy a spring evening, and then this hooded maniac appears out of nowhere. Betty Jo Booker was only 17 when she died. That thought kept creeping into my head as I walked deeper into the park, and it made the whole place feel heavy, like the ground itself remembered what happened. About 30 minutes into my shoot, I came across something I hadn't expected, an old memorial marker partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It was just a simple stone plaque, weathered and covered in moss, with the names of the 5 victims carved into it. Someone had left fresh flowers there, which caught me off guard. They couldn't have been more than a day or two old, bright yellow daisies in a mason jar. Who was still leaving flowers for people who died almost 80 years ago? I took some photos of the memorial, and as I was crouching down to get a better angle, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around fast, my heart jumping, and saw a man standing about 15 feet away. He was older, maybe in his 60s, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt, with this intense stare that made me uncomfortable immediately. "You hear about the phantom?" he asked, his voice gravelly like he'd been smoking for decades. I stood up, trying to look casual, and said, "Yeah, I was just taking some photos for a project." He nodded slowly, looking past me at the memorial. "I'm Gerald Hutchins," he said, and that name hit me like a punch. This was the local historian whose blog I'd read last night at the truck stop. What were the odds? He explained he came out here every week to tend the memorial, that he felt someone should remember those kids properly. We talked for a bit about the case, and he told me things that weren't in any of the articles I'd read. How the phantom supposedly had this specific whistle he'd do before attacking. How some people heard it echoing through the park for years afterward, even though the murders stopped. Then Gerald asked me something that made my stomach drop. "You camp out here last night?" I must have looked shocked because he immediately raised his hands like he wasn't trying to scare me. He explained that he'd driven past around 10 p.m. and seen my van parked down that dirt road. Thought about stopping to warn me off, but figured I'd be fine. I told him about the hooded figure, the message in the dirt, everything. His expression went from concern to something darker. Fear, maybe, or recognition. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Earl Vance. You stirred up Earl Vance." I asked what he meant, and he told me that Vance's old house was less than a quarter mile from where I'd parked. The property's been abandoned since 1947, completely overgrown now, but locals say weird things happen around there. People see lights in the windows sometimes, hear that same whistle the phantom used. Gerald said something that really disturbed me. He told me that in all his research, he'd become convinced that Vance was the phantom, but he also believed Vance had done something to himself on that property, some kind of ritual or deal with darkness that kept part of him there. "The message you saw, stay awake. That's what Vance used to tell the cops when they questioned him," Gerald said. He claimed if he fell asleep, the victims would come for him, drag him down. He said staying awake was the only way to keep them away. My hands were shaking again just hearing this. I asked Gerald why he'd never mentioned this publicly, and he said people already thought he was crazy enough for caring about the case. He'd tried telling others about the paranormal activity around Vance's property, but nobody wanted to hear it. Texarkana wanted to forget, not remember. Gerald offered to show me where Vance's old property was. And despite every instinct screaming at me to just leave Texarkana and never look back, I said yes. I think part of me needed to see it in daylight, needed to understand what I'd actually been parked next to the night before. We took his pickup truck because the path to the house wasn't really a road anymore, just an overgrown trail that would have torn up my van. As we drove, he told me more about Earl Vance, how the man had been a loner, how co-workers at the textile mill said he'd sometimes show up with scratches on his arms that he couldn't explain, how in his final weeks before disappearing, he'd stopped sleeping entirely. Witnesses said his eyes were bloodshot and wild, that he talked to himself constantly. The truck bounced along the rutted path for maybe 5 minutes before Gerald stopped and pointed ahead. Through the thick trees and undergrowth, I could barely make out the shape of a structure, what was left of Vance's house. It was a small, single-story place, the roof mostly collapsed, the walls leaning at odd angles. Vines had completely consumed the exterior, and several trees had grown up through what used to be the foundation. We got out and walked closer, and I could feel it immediately, that same heavy, wrong feeling I'd had last night. The air felt colder near the house, even though the sun was shining bright overhead. Gerald stopped at what had been the front porch, now just rotted boards and debris, and said he wouldn't go inside. He'd tried once, years ago, and something about the place made him physically ill. But I'm an idiot, apparently, because I had to see. I climbed carefully over the threshold, my camera around my neck, and stepped into what had been the main living area. The interior was destroyed, collapsed ceiling beams, broken furniture covered in decades of rot, and animal droppings, shattered glass everywhere. But there was something else. On one wall that was still partially standing, I could see writing. Not graffiti from kids, but carved deeply into the wood, old and weathered. I got closer and felt my chest tighten. The same 2 words repeated over and over, dozens of times, carved in frantic, jagged letters. Stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. The wall was covered with it, floor to ceiling, like someone had spent hours obsessively carving the same message. This was Vance's handwriting, his desperation preserved in rotted wood. I started taking photos, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep the camera steady. That's when I noticed something in the corner of the room, a doorway leading down. A basement or cellar of some kind. The stairs were mostly intact, disappearing into darkness below. Gerald called from outside, asking if I was okay, and I yelled back that I was fine, but I wasn't fine. I was terrified and fascinated in equal measure. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it down those stairs. I could see dirt floor at the bottom, maybe 12 feet down, and something else, shapes on the walls. I knew I shouldn't go down there. Every horror movie I'd ever seen, every true crime story I'd researched, they all taught the same lesson. Don't go into the scary basement. But I did anyway, taking the steps slowly, testing each one before putting my full weight on it. The basement was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with a low ceiling that made me feel claustrophobic immediately. The walls were dirt, partially reinforced with old timber, and they were covered in more carvings. But these weren't words, they were faces. Dozens of faces carved into the dirt walls, crude and disturbing, with hollow eyes and open mouths like they were screaming. I recognized some of them from the photos I'd seen of the Phantom's victims. The round face that looked like Betty Jo Booker, the angular features that could have been Richard Griffin. Vance had carved his victims into these walls, surrounding himself with them. In the center of the room was a metal cot frame, the mattress long since rotted away, and beneath it I could see something that made my blood run cold. Bones. Small animal bones arranged in circles, dozens of them, like some kind of ritual had been performed here. I backed up toward the stairs, my light sweeping across the room one more time, and that's when I saw it, scratched into the dirt floor in letters at least 2 feet tall. I'm still awake. The words were fresh. I'm not talking 70-something years old. I'm talking fresh, like someone had dragged their fingers through the dirt recently, maybe last night, maybe this morning. The edges were sharp, the dirt still loose. I ran. I don't remember climbing those stairs, don't remember getting out of the house, but suddenly I was outside grabbing Gerald's arm and pulling him back toward the truck. He kept asking what happened, what I'd seen, but I couldn't form words. We got in the truck and he drove us back to the main park area, and only then could I explain. When I showed him the photos on my camera, zooming in on that fresh message in the basement, his face went pale. Gerald said something I'll never forget. He looked at me dead serious and said, "Earl Vance never left that property. Part of him is still down there, still awake, still living out whatever hell he created for himself. And when you parked there last night, you woke him up. You gave him attention, energy, whatever you want to call it. That message wasn't a threat, it was a statement. He's telling you he's still there, still trapped in his own nightmare." I asked what I should do, and he said to leave Texarkana immediately and never come back. Don't look up anything more about the case, don't think about it, don't give it any more of my energy. Some darkness feeds on attention, he said, and the worst thing you can do is keep feeding it. I left Spring Lake Park 20 minutes later, didn't even go back to grab anything from town. I just pointed my van east toward Arkansas and drove, checking my mirrors constantly, half expecting to see a hooded figure standing on the side of the road. I made it home to Little Rock by early evening, and I thought that was the end of it. But 3 nights later, I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. to someone whistling outside my house. That same low, 3-note whistle Gerald had described. I looked out my bedroom window and saw a figure in a hood standing under the streetlight across from my driveway. I called the police, but by the time they arrived 10 minutes later, the figure was gone. The cops found nothing, said it was probably just a homeless person passing through. But I know what I saw. And now, most nights, I don't really sleep much anymore. I stay awake, just like the message said, because I'm terrified of what might be waiting if I close my eyes. My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm 38 years old, and I live in Dallas. I've been working remotely as a software developer for about 5 years now, and the Vanlife setup just made sense for me. I converted a 2019 Ford Transit into basically a mobile office, got my dual monitor setup, a solid internet booster for my hotspot, solar panels to keep everything running, the whole deal. It's perfect because I can take these long weekends, drive somewhere quiet, knock out my work during the week, and explore on my days off. No kids, no wife, just me and my laptop and the open road. My buddies think I'm nuts, but honestly, it beats sitting in a Dallas apartment staring at the same 4 walls. I'd pick Texarkana kind of randomly, if I'm being honest. I was looking at maps trying to find somewhere within a few hours of Dallas that I hadn't been to yet, and Texarkana popped up. I knew it was split between Texas and Arkansas, thought that was kind of interesting, and figured it'd be quiet enough to get some work done. I had a big project deadline coming up, rebuilding a database architecture for a client, and I needed to focus without distractions. The plan was simple: find a good spot to park for a few days, work during business hours, maybe hit up some local restaurants in the evenings, and just decompress. I left Dallas on a Thursday afternoon. Traffic was hell getting out of the city like always, but once I hit I-30, it was smooth sailing. I got into Texarkana around 7 p.m., stopped at a Sonic for dinner because I'm a sucker for their cherry limeades, and started scouting for a place to post up for the night. I'd learned from experience that the best stealth camping spots are places that used to be something but aren't anymore. Old parking lots, abandoned businesses, that kind of thing. People don't really pay attention to those areas, and as long as you're not obvious about it, nobody bothers you. I was driving down this service road on the east side of town when I saw it. An old drive-in theater, completely abandoned. The big screen was still standing, though it was faded and had holes in it, and the speaker posts were still in the ground, even though most of the speakers were long gone. The place was called the Starlight Drive-In according to the faded sign out front, and it looked like it had been closed for decades. The entrance gate was chained but not locked, just looped around the post, so I unwrapped it and drove in. The lot was cracked pavement with grass and weeds growing through everywhere, and there were maybe 50 or 60 of those old speaker posts still standing in rows. It was actually kind of beautiful in a sad, nostalgic way, like a time capsule from the 50s or 60s. I found a spot in the back row, far from the road, where my van would be hidden by some overgrown bushes. Perfect. I could work here undisturbed for a few days, and if anyone did show up, I could just say I was scouting locations for a film project or something. I got my workspace set up inside the van, monitors connected, laptop charging, my ergonomic keyboard because I'm not trying to get carpal tunnel out here. I had a video call scheduled with my client for 8:30, so I tested my connection and it was solid, surprisingly good signal for being in the middle of nowhere. The call went fine, talked through some technical requirements, promised I'd have the first phase done by Monday. After that, I spent a couple hours coding, getting into that flow state where time kind of disappears. Around 11 p.m., I decided to call it and stepped outside to stretch my legs. The night air was cool, felt good after being cooped up in the van. I walked around a bit, looking at the old drive-in screen lit up by moonlight, imagining what this place must have been like back in its heyday. That's when I noticed the car. It was parked about 6 rows ahead of me, closer to the screen, and I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there when I'd arrived. It was this old sedan, maybe from the 70s, dark-colored, hard to tell exactly in the dim light. No lights on, no movement that I could see, just sitting there. My first thought was maybe it was another camper or someone who'd had the same idea as me about using this place. But something felt off about it. The car looked too old, too vintage, like it belonged in the same era as the drive-in itself. I watched it for a few minutes, waiting to see if someone would get out or turn on their headlights, but nothing happened. It just sat there, completely still. I decided whoever it was probably wanted privacy, same as me, so I went back inside my van and locked the doors for the night. I woke up around 7 a.m. to my alarm, feeling pretty good considering I'd slept in a van. I made coffee using my little espresso maker, one of the best investments I ever made for this setup, and opened my laptop to check emails. My client had sent over some revised specs overnight, typical, so I spent the morning working through those changes. Around 9, I remembered that old car from last night and got curious. I stepped outside with my coffee and looked toward where I'd seen it parked. It was gone, completely gone. The pavement where it had been was empty except for the usual weeds and cracks. I walked over to that spot, not really sure what I was looking for, and didn't find anything unusual. No tire tracks in the dirt around the edges, no oil stains, nothing to prove a car had even been there. I shook it off, figured maybe I'd been more tired than I thought and the shadows had played tricks on me. Or maybe someone really had been there and left early in the morning before I woke up. Either way, it didn't matter. I had work to do. I spent most of the day inside the van coding, taking breaks every couple hours to walk around and keep my back from getting stiff. The drive-in was actually a pretty peaceful place during the day. Birds everywhere, butterflies landing on the wildflowers growing through the pavement, just this weird abandoned beauty to it. Around 3 p.m., I decided to do some exploring beyond just the parking area. There was an old concession stand building near the entrance, windows all busted out, and I wanted to check it out. The building was more destroyed than I expected. The roof had caved in on one side, and everything inside was rotted or vandalized. I could still make out the counter where they would have served popcorn and sodas, and there were some old movie posters on the walls, so faded you couldn't even tell what films they were advertising. I took a few pictures with my phone, thinking maybe I'd post them on Instagram or something, and that's when I found the newspaper clipping. It was in a plastic sleeve, thumbtacked to the wall behind the counter, protected enough that I could still read it. The headline said, "Local teens frequent drive-in before tragedy," and it was dated March 1946. My stomach did this little flip because I suddenly remembered, Texarkana, 1946, the Phantom Killer. The article talked about how the Starlight Drive-In had been a popular spot for young couples before the murder started, how several of the victims had been seen there on dates in the weeks before they were attacked. It specifically mentioned Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin coming here to see a movie just days before they were killed. The article had this haunting quality to it, talking about how the whole town had loved this place. But after the Phantom started targeting lovers' lanes and quiet parking spots, people stopped coming. The drive-in closed permanently in 1947, less than a year after the murders stopped, because nobody felt safe anymore. I stood there reading this thing multiple times, and this disturbing realization hit me. I was sleeping in the exact kind of place where the Phantom had hunted. Isolated, dark, full of parked cars. I went back to my van feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite shake. I tried to focus on work, but I kept thinking about that article, about those kids who just wanted to watch a movie and ended up dead. Around 6 p.m., I drove into town to grab dinner, needed to get away from the drive-in for a bit. I found this local barbecue place and sat at the counter eating brisket, scrolling through my phone reading about the Phantom case. The more I read, the more creeped out I got. The killer had never been caught, just disappeared, and there were all these theories, that he'd died, that he'd moved to another state, that he was actually multiple people. Some articles mentioned witnesses hearing a specific whistle before the attacks, a 3-note pattern that became associated with the Phantom. When I got back to the drive-in around 8:30, it was just starting to get dark. I parked in the same spot as the night before and noticed something immediately that made my chest tight. The old car was back. Same position, maybe 6 rows ahead. Same dark sedan from the 70s. But here's what really freaked me out. I'd been gone less than 2 hours, and I'd watched that parking lot in my rearview mirror when I left. There had been no other vehicles here. This car had appeared while I was gone, which meant someone was actively coming here, to this abandoned drive-in, and parking in the same spot. I sat in my van watching it, waiting for any sign of movement, any indication someone was inside. The minutes ticked by, 5, 10, 15, and nothing. No dome light, no silhouette, no sound of doors opening. Finally, I decided I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked toward the car. My heart was pounding harder with each step. As I got closer, I could see it was a Chevy Impala, dark blue, or maybe black, definitely from the early 70s based on the body style. The windows were tinted or dirty. I couldn't see inside. I walked around to the driver's side and shined my light through the window. Empty. Completely empty. No one in the front seats. No one in the back. I tried the door handle, locked. I walked around the entire car, checking every window, and there was absolutely no one inside. But the car was real, solid. I could touch it. This wasn't some hallucination or shadow. Someone had driven this car here, and then, what? Just vanished? I backed away from that Impala and speed walked back to my van, my skin crawling. I locked myself inside and just sat there trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe the owner had walked off into the woods for some reason, or maybe there was another vehicle that had picked them up while I was checking out the car. But I hadn't heard any engines, hadn't seen any headlights, and the drive-in only had one entrance. None of it made sense. I pulled up Google on my laptop and started searching for information about the Starlight Drive-In specifically, and what I found made everything worse. There were forum posts, Reddit threads, even a paranormal investigation blog about this place. Multiple people reported seeing vintage cars appear in the lot at night, always the same era, late 60s, early 70s, always empty when approached. One post from a guy in 2017 described almost exactly what I was experiencing. He'd been exploring the drive-in during the day and came back at night to take photos. Saw an old Pontiac parked near the screen. When he walked up to it, there was nobody inside, but he said he heard music playing. Faint, like it was coming from far away, some old 50s love song. He got so scared he left immediately. Another person claimed they'd seen figures sitting in the phantom cars, shadowy shapes that looked like couples, but when they got close enough to see clearly, the figures would vanish. The general consensus in these threads was that the drive-in was haunted by the memories of the Phantom era, that something about the violence and fear had soaked into the place and kept replaying itself. I'm not really a believer in ghosts or paranormal stuff. I'm a software developer. I deal in logic and code, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. That car was out there right now, solid and real. I looked out my windshield and could still see its dark shape in the moonlight. Part of me wanted to just start the van and drive back to Dallas, forget this whole trip. But another part, the stubborn part, was pissed off. I'd paid for a week of remote work time. I had this deadline, and I wasn't about to let some weird occurrence run me off. I decided I'd stay in the van, keep the doors locked, and if anything truly threatening happened, I'd leave. Otherwise, I was going to finish my work and deal with whatever this was. Around 11 p.m., I was back to coding when I heard it. Music. Faint at first, so quiet I thought maybe I was imagining it, or it was coming from a distant house. But it got gradually louder, and I realized with this sinking feeling that it was coming from outside, from the direction of that Impala. I muted my laptop and listened. It was definitely music, something old and crackly, like it was playing through a damaged speaker, some slow romantic song from the 50s. The kind of music they would have played at a drive-in back in the day. I sat frozen, my hands hovering over my keyboard, trying to decide what to do. The song played for maybe 3 minutes, and then stopped abruptly, like someone had turned off a radio. Silence again, just the wind and distant highway noise. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, made sure it was fully charged, and opened the camera app. If weird stuff was happening, I was going to document it. I stepped outside, keeping my van between me and the Impala, and started recording video. I narrated quietly, explaining what I'd seen, when I'd seen it, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was terrified. Then I walked toward the car again, phone held out in front of me, the screen illuminating my path. As I got closer, I could see something I hadn't noticed before. There was condensation on the inside of the windows, like someone had been breathing in there recently. But I checked this car less than 3 hours ago, and it had been empty. I reached out and touched the hood. It was warm, not hot like an engine that had just been running, but warm like a body temperature, like something alive had been resting against it. I moved to the driver's side window and peered inside again, my phone's light cutting through the darkness. The interior looked different somehow. The seats looked less deteriorated, the dashboard looked almost clean. And then I saw it, sitting on the passenger seat. A pair of women's glasses, cat-eye style from the 50s or 60s, with rhinestones on the corners. They definitely hadn't been there before. I tried the door handle again, still locked, but now I could see through the window that there was something else in the back seat. A purse, old-fashioned, white leather with a gold clasp. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped my phone. These objects were appearing inside a locked car, objects from 70 years ago, and I had no explanation for any of it. That's when I heard the whistle. It came from somewhere behind me, near the concession stand. 3 notes, low and slow, the exact pattern I'd read about in those Phantom Killer articles. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every muscle in my body tensed. I turned slowly, panning my phone's camera toward the sound, and saw a figure standing in the doorway of the concession building. Just a silhouette, backlit by moonlight, but I could tell it was a man, tall, wearing what looked like a hat or hood. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching me. I did the only sensible thing. I ran. I sprinted back to my van, fumbling with the keys, threw myself inside and locked the doors. I started the engine immediately, threw it in reverse, and tore out of that parking lot. I didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station on the highway with bright lights and other people around. I sat in that gas station parking lot for over an hour, my heart still racing, replaying the video I'd recorded on my phone. I watched it 3 times, and everything was there. The Impala, the condensation, me narrating about the warm hood. But when the camera panned toward the concession stand where I'd seen the figure, there was nothing. Just an empty doorway and darkness. The whistle wasn't on the recording either, though I'd heard it clear as day. My hands were still shaking as I posted the video to a paranormal subreddit with a detailed explanation of what happened. Within minutes, people were commenting, some calling it fake, others sharing their own Texarkana stories. One user sent me a private message that made my blood run cold. They said, "If you heard the whistle, he's marked you. Don't go back." But here's the thing, all my stuff was still at the drive-in. My monitors, my backup drives with months of work, clothes, my portable solar panels worth like $2,000. I couldn't just abandon everything because I got spooked. I sat there doing mental calculations, weighing my options. It was almost 1 a.m. now, and I hadn't slept. The smart move would be to wait until morning, go back in broad daylight, grab my stuff, and get the hell out of Texarkana forever. I found a 24-hour diner nearby, and went inside, ordered coffee, and just sat in a booth trying to calm down. The waitress, this woman in her 50s with tired eyes, asked if I was okay. I must have looked pretty rough. I told her I'd had car trouble near the old Starlight Drive-In, and her expression changed immediately. She sat down across from me without asking, which was weird but also somehow comforting. Her name tag said Rita. She told me she'd grown up in Texarkana, remembered when the drive-in was still operating in the 70s before it finally shut down for good. She said the place had always had a bad reputation, even 20 years after the Phantom murders. Teenagers would dare each other to go there at night, and plenty of them came back with stories about seeing things, old cars that shouldn't be there, people in vintage clothes, sounds that didn't make sense. Rita said her own brother went there on a dare in 1979, came back white as a sheet, wouldn't talk about what he'd seen for weeks. Eventually, he told her he'd watched a car appear out of nowhere, watched a couple get out of it dressed like they were from the 50s, watched them walk toward the screen holding hands, and then just fade away like smoke. Rita leaned in close and said something that made my chest tight. The Phantom didn't just kill those people's bodies. He killed this town's innocence, killed the idea that we were safe. Places like that drive-in, they absorbed all that fear and violence, and it never really left. Whatever you saw out there, it's not trying to hurt you. It's just stuck, playing out the same night over and over, trapped in time. I asked her what I should do, and she said to go back at dawn, get my things quickly, and never return. She also said to not look directly at anything strange I might see. Don't engage with it. Just grab my stuff and go. Acknowledging it gives it power, she said, and I'd already given it plenty of attention by recording it and posting about it online. I waited at that diner until the sky started getting light around 6 a.m. Drinking so much coffee, I was jittery as hell. I drove back to the Starlight Drive-In with my stomach in knots, half expecting to find my van vandalized or gone entirely. But it was right where I'd left it, untouched, and the Impala was gone again. The morning sun made everything look normal, just an abandoned drive-in with overgrown weeds and faded paint. I worked fast, disconnecting my monitors, throwing clothes into bags, not bothering to organize anything properly. I just wanted out. I was maybe 15 minutes into packing when I heard a car engine. My blood went cold because I was certain I was alone out here. I looked out my van window and saw a white pickup truck pulling into the lot, some guy in his 40s climbing out. He walked over with this easy smile, completely casual, and introduced himself as Tommy. Said he was a local electrician who sometimes used the drive-in lot to store equipment because nobody bothered it. He noticed I was packing up in a hurry and asked if everything was okay. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I just said I'd had a weird night and was heading out. Tommy nodded like he understood more than I was saying, then told me something that made my skin crawl. He said about 6 months ago, he'd been here late in the evening moving some supplies and saw the same thing I probably saw. Old cars appearing, hearing strange sounds. He'd talked to his grandfather about it, who'd actually lived through the Phantom era, and his grandfather told him that Earl Vance, one of the main suspects in the murders, used to work as a projectionist at the Starlight Drive-In before it closed. Tommy said his grandfather believed Vance had killed those people and then haunted the places he'd worked and lived for the rest of his life, even after he died or disappeared or whatever happened to him. The drive-in was one of those places, and according to local legend, Vance was still here in some form, reliving the nights before he became a killer, when things were still innocent and normal. The old cars, the music, the couples, they were all memories bleeding through from 1946, before everything went wrong. And the figure in the hood, that was Vance himself, or what was left of him, watching those memories play out over and over, unable to move on. Tommy said the smartest thing anyone could do was stay away from this place after dark, because the more attention you gave those memories, the stronger and more real they became. I finished packing in record time, thanked Tommy for the information, and drove out of that parking lot without looking back. I made it maybe 5 miles down the highway when I realized I'd forgotten something. My external hard drive with all my client work sitting on the desk shelf in the van. I pulled over and tore through my bags, my equipment, everything. It wasn't there. I must have left it sitting on the shelf and forgotten to grab it in my rush. My heart sank because that drive had 3 months of work on it, including the project I was supposed to deliver by Monday. I sat on the side of the highway with my head in my hands, doing the math. I could go back right now, run in, grab the drive, be out in 2 minutes. It was still morning, still daylight, still safe. Or I could drive to Dallas, try to recreate weeks of work from scratch, probably lose my client, and take a massive financial hit. The choice should have been obvious, but I was so scared of that place that I actually considered just abandoning the work. I turned the van around. I had to. 3 months of work, probably 15 grand worth of billable hours, all sitting on a drive the size of my palm. I kept telling myself it was daylight. Tommy had just been there. Everything was fine. The drive back to the Starlight felt longer than it should have, and when I pulled into the lot, Tommy's truck was gone. I was alone again. I parked right next to the entrance this time, ready for a quick exit, and ran to where I'd been set up. The hard drive was exactly where I remembered leaving it, sitting on the little shelf mount I'd built. I grabbed it, shoved it in my pocket, and turned to leave. That's when I saw the Impala was back, parked in its usual spot 6 rows away, even though it was barely 9 in the morning. My first instinct was to run, just get in my van and go, but something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was frustration at being scared for 2 days straight, but I walked toward that car instead. I was done running from something I didn't understand. As I got closer, I could see the interior clearly in the morning light, and it wasn't empty anymore. There were 2 people inside, a young couple, and they looked completely solid and real. The girl was in the passenger seat wearing a yellow dress, her hair done up in that 50s style, and the guy was behind the wheel in slacks and a white button-up shirt. They were talking to each other, smiling, completely unaware of me. I could see their mouths moving but couldn't hear any sound. I stood maybe 10 feet away, just watching them, and the girl suddenly turned and looked directly at me. Her smile faded, and her expression changed to confusion, then fear. She grabbed the guy's arm and pointed at me, and he turned to look too. They both looked terrified, and I realized with this sick clarity that from their perspective, I was the ghost. I was the thing that didn't belong in their time. The guy started the car. I heard the engine roar to life, and threw it in reverse. I jumped back as the Impala peeled backward out of the spot, the tires kicking up dust, and then the whole car just dissolved. Like it was made of smoke or mist, it broke apart and vanished, leaving nothing but empty pavement and the smell of old exhaust. I stood there shaking, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. They'd been real people, or at least they had been once, and now they were trapped in some kind of loop, reliving the same night over and over. Rita's words came back to me. The drive-in absorbed the fear and violence, and it never left. These weren't just random ghosts. They were the victims, or potential victims. The kids who'd come here looking for privacy and innocence before the phantom destroyed everything. I thought about Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin. Thought about how they'd probably sat in a car just like that Impala, thinking they had their whole lives ahead of them, and then hours later they were dead. The injustice of it, the horror of it, hit me all at once, and I felt this overwhelming sadness. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the concession stand. I turned around and saw him, the figure in the hood, standing maybe 30 feet away in broad daylight. But now I could see details I hadn't seen at night. He was tall, wearing dark clothes and a cloth hood over his face with rough-cut eye holes, exactly like the descriptions from 1946. But here's what froze me in place. I could see through him. Not completely, but enough to know he wasn't solid. He was like a projection, a shadow burned into the air itself. He started walking toward me, not fast but with purpose, and I could hear that whistle again. 3 notes that cut through the morning silence like a knife. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But instead, I pulled out my phone and took a picture. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof. Maybe I just needed to do something that felt like control. The camera clicked, and the figure stopped walking. He tilted his head like he was confused, and then he raised one hand and pointed directly at me. Not threatening, not aggressive, just pointing, like he was marking me or remembering me. I could feel the weight of that gesture, the significance of it, and finally my legs remembered how to move. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran for my van. I could hear those footsteps following me, steady and unhurried, the gravel crunching under feet that shouldn't exist. I made it to my van, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw him standing exactly where my van had been parked, still pointing in my direction. I started the engine, my hands fumbling with the gear shift, and drove out of that lot for what I swore would be the last time. But as I turned onto the main road, I looked back one more time and saw the entire parking lot filled with cars, dozens of them, all vintage models from the 40s and 50s, all occupied by young couples in old-fashioned clothes. The Starlight Drive-In looked exactly like it must have in 1946, alive and thriving, and standing in front of the big screen was the hooded figure, watching over all of them like some kind of twisted guardian. I drove straight back to Dallas, didn't stop except for gas, made the 3-hour trip in under 2.5 hours. I checked into a hotel that night because I couldn't stand to be in my van, couldn't stand to be alone in an enclosed space after everything I'd experienced. I looked at the photo I'd taken on my phone, and it showed the hooded figure clear as day, standing in that parking lot in full daylight, pointing at the camera. I posted it online with a detailed account of everything that happened, and the responses were split. Half the people said it was obviously faked. The other half shared their own Texarkana stories, their own encounters with the Phantom's ghost. One message stood out from the rest. It was from someone claiming to be Gerald Hutchins's grandson, and he said his grandfather had died 2 years ago, but had left behind journals about the paranormal activity in Texarkana. According to the message, Gerald had believed that Earl Vance performed some kind of ritual before he disappeared, something that bound him to the locations of his crimes and the places he frequented. The Starlight Drive-In was one of them, and Vance's spirit was trapped there, forever reliving the nights before he became a monster, watching the innocents he destroyed play out over and over. The grandson said the pointing gesture I described was significant. It meant Vance had acknowledged me as a witness, as someone who'd seen his shame and guilt made manifest. He'd marked me not as a victim, but as someone who carried his story now, someone who couldn't forget what they'd seen. The message ended with a warning: don't go back. He'll remember you if you do. I haven't been back to Texarkana, and I don't plan to ever return. But here's the thing that scares me most. Sometimes, late at night when I'm parked somewhere for work, I hear it. That three-note whistle, faint and distant, like it's coming from miles away, but also right outside my door. I'll look out and see nothing, just empty parking lots or quiet streets, but I know what I heard. It's like by witnessing what happened at that drive-in, by photographing it and sharing it, I brought a piece of it back with me. Some nights I dream about those kids in the Impala, about their faces when they realized I didn't belong in their time. And some nights I dream about the hooded figure standing in that parking lot, still pointing, still watching, waiting for me to make the mistake of coming back. I've thought about selling my van, getting an apartment, going back to a normal life. But I'm not sure it would matter. I think some darkness, once you've seen it, follows you no matter where you go. The only thing I can do is stay aware, stay alert, and never, ever go back to Texarkana. Because I know if I do, the Phantom, or whatever's left of him, will be waiting. And this time, I might not make it out. My name is Kelsey Drummond. I'm 51 years old, and I live in Oklahoma City. I've been a freelance journalist for about 20 years now, mostly covering true crime and cold cases for magazines and podcasts. It's not the most cheerful work, but it pays well, and I'm good at it. I've got this ability to get people to open up, to trust me with their stories. I'm divorced, been that way for 8 years, and my son Brendan is 28 and lives in Seattle doing something with tech that I don't fully understand. So it's just me and my work, which is fine. I like the independence, like being able to chase whatever story interests me without having to check in with anyone. I'd pitched a story to Crime Chronicles magazine about the Phantom Killer. They were doing a 79th anniversary feature on unsolved American murder cases, and Texarkana seemed perfect. The case had everything: brutal murders, a mysterious killer who was never caught, a small town forever changed by violence. I'd done preliminary research from home, read all the books and articles, but I needed boots on the ground. I needed to talk to people, see the locations, feel the atmosphere of the place. That's how you write stories that matter, stories that stick with readers. So I rented this gorgeous vintage Airstream from a guy in Oklahoma City, silver bullet style, fully restored with modern amenities, and hooked it up to my SUV. The plan was to spend 2 weeks in Texarkana, really immerse myself in the story. I found a private campground called Pinewood Trails about 2 miles from downtown Texarkana. Nice little spot with full hookups and Wi-Fi. The owner was this friendly woman named Carol, probably in her 60s, who seemed excited to have a journalist staying there. She gave me a prime spot under some big oak trees, plenty of privacy, and we chatted for a bit about my project. When I mentioned I was researching the Phantom murders, her smile got a little stiff. She said most locals preferred not to talk about it, that it was old history best left alone, but she was polite about it. I thanked her for the warning and got set up, leveled the trailer, connected everything, made myself at home. It was actually really nice, felt like a little silver sanctuary. I spent my first evening organizing my research materials, pinning up a timeline on the trailer wall, marking locations on a map of Texarkana. The 5 victims: Virgil Starks, Katie Starks who survived, Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Paul Martin, and Betty Jo Booker. The dates: February through May 1946. The locations: Spring Lake Park, a rural highway, the Starks farmhouse. The suspect who was never charged. A dozen different men over the years, but Earl Vance's name kept coming up in the research I'd found online, mentioned in obscure forums and local historian blogs. I made a list of people to interview: elderly residents who'd lived through it, family members of victims, if any were still around, local historians, retired cops. This was going to be comprehensive, the definitive article on the case. The next morning I headed into downtown Texarkana to start making connections. I stopped at the local library first, introduced myself to the head librarian, a guy named Dennis who was maybe in his 50s. I explained my project and asked if he could point me toward any archival materials or local experts. Dennis was helpful, pulled out some old newspaper microfiche for me. But when I asked about interviewing people who remembered 1946, his expression got serious. He told me that most folks who lived through the Phantom era had either died or moved away, and the ones who remained really didn't like discussing it. He said there was this unspoken rule in Texarkana: you don't bring up the Phantom unless you absolutely have to. It was like a collective trauma the town had agreed to suppress. But Dennis did give me one lead. A woman named Ethel Morrison, who was 96 years old and lived in a nursing home on the Arkansas side. She'd been a teenager during the murders and had actually known some of the victims. He said she rarely talked about it, but if I approached her respectfully, she might open up. I thanked him, spent a few hours going through the microfiche, taking photos of old articles with my phone. The language in those 1946 newspapers was incredible. They called the killer the Phantom Slayer, described the town as being gripped by terror, reported on how people were arming themselves and refusing to go out after dark. You could feel the fear bleeding through even 79 years later. I left the library around 3 p.m. and decided to drive by some of the actual locations before attempting any interviews. Spring Lake Park was first on my list. I'd read about it being abandoned, but seeing it in person was something else. This sad, forgotten place that had probably been beautiful once. I walked around taking photos, trying to imagine what it was like in 1946 when couples came here for privacy. I found that memorial stone with the victims' names, and standing there looking at it, I felt this wave of sadness. These were real kids with real futures that got stolen. I crouched down, took some close-up shots of the names, and that's when I noticed something weird. Someone had left a piece of paper tucked under the edge of the memorial stone, partially hidden. I pulled it out carefully. It was a note, handwritten on lined paper, and it said, "Stop asking questions. Some dead things should stay buried." No signature, no date, just that message in shaky handwriting. My journalist instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't some old note. The paper was clean, barely weathered. Someone had left this recently, maybe even today. But how would anyone know I was here researching the case? I'd literally just arrived in town yesterday. I folded the note carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was just a coincidence, some random person leaving cryptic messages around town. Or maybe Carol from the campground had mentioned to someone that a journalist was in town researching the Phantom, and word had spread. Small towns are like that. Everybody knows everybody's business within hours. Still, the timing felt too perfect, too deliberate. I took a few more photos and headed back to my SUV, feeling like I was being watched even though I couldn't see anyone around. The park was completely empty, just me and the wind moving through the trees, but that feeling of eyes on me wouldn't go away. I drove to the next location on my list, the site where Virgil and Katie Starks had lived, way out on a rural highway. The original farmhouse was long gone, replaced decades ago by a modern ranch-style home with a well-maintained lawn. I didn't feel right bothering whoever lived there now, so I just pulled over on the shoulder and looked at the property from my car. This was where the Phantom had changed his pattern. Instead of attacking couples in parked cars, he'd shot through the window of this house, killed Virgil, and badly wounded Katie. It was a terrifying escalation that suggested the killer was getting bolder, less careful. I sat there imagining what Katie must have gone through, surviving her husband's murder and her own injuries, living with that trauma for the rest of her life. She died in the 1990s according to my research, never knowing who destroyed her family. My phone buzzed with a text from Dennis at the library. He'd contacted Ethel Morrison's nursing home, and she'd agreed to see me tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. I felt this surge of excitement, actual primary source testimony from someone who'd lived through it. I texted back my thanks and decided to spend the rest of the day exploring downtown Texarkana, getting a feel for the place. The town had this weird split personality, literally divided by the state line, and you could see architectural differences between the Texas side and Arkansas side. I grabbed dinner at a local diner called Betty's, and the waitress was chatty enough until I mentioned I was researching the Phantom case. Her whole demeanor changed, got cold, and closed off. She said she didn't know anything about it, and basically ignored me for the rest of my meal. I got back to my Airstream around 8 p.m. and spent the evening transcribing notes, organizing photos, planning questions for Ethel. Around 10:30, I heard voices outside, not close to my trailer, but somewhere else in the campground. It sounded like an argument, a man and woman going back and forth, their voices getting louder. I peeked out my window, but couldn't see anyone in the darkness. The campground only had a few other occupied sites, and they were all spread out pretty far. The voices continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I figured it was just campers having a disagreement and went back to my work. But then I heard footsteps on gravel, coming closer to my trailer. They stopped right outside, and I froze, listening. Someone knocked on my door, 3 sharp raps that made me jump. I looked through the peephole and saw a man standing there, maybe in his 70s, wearing an old-fashioned suit and hat like something from the 40s. My first thought was that he was headed to some costume party or historical reenactment. But who does that at almost 11 p.m.? I cracked the door open, keeping the security chain attached, and asked if I could help him. He looked at me with these intense, bloodshot eyes and said in this raspy voice, "You need to leave Texarkana. Tonight. Don't write your article. Don't talk to Ethel. Just go." I asked who he was and how he knew about my article, but he just repeated himself, "Leave tonight. While you still can." Then he turned and walked away into the darkness, his footsteps fading into silence. I stood there with my heart pounding, completely rattled. I grabbed my phone to call Carol, the campground owner, to report some weirdo harassing guests, but I had no cell signal. That was weird because I'd had full bars earlier. I tried connecting to the campground Wi-Fi. Nothing. My internet was completely down. I locked the door, checked all the windows, and sat on my bed trying to calm down. The rational part of my brain said it was just some local trying to scare me off, maybe someone who resented outsiders dredging up painful history. But the way he was dressed, the way he moved, something felt deeply wrong about the whole interaction. I pulled out the note I'd found at Spring Lake Park and read it again. Stop asking questions. Some dead things should stay buried. Around midnight, I was lying in bed unable to sleep when I heard it. A whistle outside, 3 long notes that sounded almost like a melody. It was distant but clear, coming from somewhere beyond the trees that surrounded my sight. I sat up, my chest tight with fear, because I recognized that pattern. I'd read about it in multiple accounts of the Phantom murders. Witnesses had reported hearing a distinctive 3-note whistle before or after the attacks. It had become one of the signature elements of the case, though nobody knew if the Phantom himself had made that sound or if it was just urban legend that grew over time. But hearing it now, out here in the dark, made my skin crawl. The whistle repeated, slightly closer this time, and I could hear footsteps in the leaves, someone walking slowly through the woods near my trailer. I grabbed my phone and tried calling 911, but without signal it was useless. The footsteps kept circling my trailer, crunching through leaves and snapping twigs, and that whistle came again. 3 notes, each one holding longer than the last. I pulled back the curtain just a fraction and looked out into the darkness. At first I couldn't see anything except shadows and trees, but then movement caught my eye. There was someone standing maybe 40 feet away, partially hidden behind an oak tree, watching my trailer. I couldn't make out details, just a dark silhouette, tall and still, but I knew without a doubt they were staring directly at my window. I let the curtain fall and backed away, my breath coming fast and shallow. The footsteps started moving again, coming around to the door side of my trailer. I heard them stop right at my steps, and then silence. Just horrible, waiting silence. I stood frozen in the middle of my airstream, holding my phone like it was some kind of weapon even though it was useless without signal. Then came a scratching sound on my door, like fingernails dragging slowly down the aluminum. It went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. I waited for the footsteps to move away, for some indication that whoever it was had left, but there was nothing. I stayed awake the entire night, sitting in the corner farthest from the door, too terrified to even lie down. Every shadow looked threatening. Every sound made me jump. When dawn finally came and light started filtering through my windows, I felt brave enough to look outside. I opened the door slowly, checking in every direction, and saw nothing unusual. No person, no signs of disturbance. But when I looked down at my metal steps, my heart sank. There were scratch marks on the door, deep ones, like someone had used their fingernails or maybe a knife to gouge the aluminum. For parallel lines dragged from top to bottom. I took photos with my phone, my hands shaking, and noticed my cell signal was back. 5 bars, like nothing had been wrong. I immediately called Carol and told her what happened. She sounded genuinely shocked and concerned, said she'd come over right away. Carol arrived within 10 minutes, and I showed her the scratch marks, told her about the old man who'd warned me to leave, about the footsteps and whistling. Her face went pale as I talked, and when I finished she was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said something that made my blood go cold. "There's no other guests staying here right now. You're the only one in the entire campground." I told her that was impossible. I'd heard voices arguing last night, heard footsteps, saw other trailers and RVs when I checked in. She shook her head slowly and said the other sites had been empty for 3 days. She was renovating her office and hadn't taken any new reservations. I was completely alone out here, had been since I arrived. I felt like the ground was shifting under me. If Carol was telling the truth, then who the hell had I heard arguing? Who was the man at my door? And more terrifyingly, who had been circling my trailer all night? Carol suggested I might want to stay somewhere else, maybe a hotel in town, and honestly I was considering it. But I'm stubborn, and I don't let fear control me. It's part of what makes me good at investigating dark stories. I told her I'd stay, but asked if she could park closer to my site, maybe in her own camper, just so I wasn't completely isolated. She agreed, said she'd bring her RV over that evening. In the meantime, I had my interview with Ethel Morrison at 2 p.m., and I wasn't about to miss that. I drove into town around noon, grabbed lunch at a Subway because I didn't want another awkward interaction at a local place, and headed to the nursing home. Shady Grove Assisted Living was a nice facility on the Arkansas side, well-maintained with a pleasant staff. I checked in at the front desk and was led to Ethel's room on the second floor. She was sitting in a recliner by the window, a tiny woman with white hair and sharp blue eyes that tracked me as I entered. The nurse introduced me and left us alone. I sat in the chair across from Ethel and explained why I was there, showed her my credentials, promised I'd be respectful of her memories. She studied me for a long time before speaking, and when she did, her voice was surprisingly strong for someone her age. "I knew you'd come eventually," she said. "Someone always comes, wanting to dig up those terrible days. But you should know that talking about the Phantom is dangerous, girl. It's not just history. It's something that never really ended." I asked her what she meant, and she told me that in the weeks after the murders stopped in 1946, people in Texarkana started having experiences, seeing figures in hoods, hearing that whistle, finding threatening messages. The police dismissed it as mass hysteria or copycats, but Ethel said it felt like something else. She said it felt like the Phantom had become more than just a man, like the fear and violence had created something that outlived whoever the actual killer was. She'd personally heard the whistle twice in her life, once in 1947 and once in 1983, both times when she was alone at night, both times followed by nothing but an overwhelming sense of dread. Ethel leaned forward in her chair and lowered her voice like she was sharing a secret. "I knew Betty Jo Booker. We went to the same church, sang in the choir together. She was so full of life, had this beautiful voice that could fill the whole sanctuary. When they found her body, something broke in this town that never healed." Her eyes got distant, remembering. She told me details about Betty Jo I'd never read anywhere. How she loved strawberry ice cream, how she wanted to be a teacher, how she'd been excited about her date with Paul Martin that night. Making them real people instead of just names on a memorial made everything feel heavier, more awful. I was taking notes carefully, treating this testimony with the respect it deserved. Then Ethel told me something that made my pen stop moving. She said that in the days before Betty Jo's murder, Betty Jo had mentioned to several friends that she felt like she was being watched. She'd seen a man in a cloth hood standing across the street from her house one evening, and when she told her father, he'd checked but found nobody. She'd heard whistling outside her window late at night. She was scared, but she was also 17 and wanted to believe it was just her imagination. If she'd listened to her instincts, if she'd stayed home that night, she might still be alive. Ethel said, her voice cracking. "But how do you explain fear like that to anyone? They just think you're being dramatic." I asked Ethel about Earl Vance, the name that kept appearing in my research. Her expression changed immediately, became guarded. She said Vance had worked at the Starlight Drive-In and also as a janitor at the high school, which meant he would have been around young people constantly. She remembered him being strange, quiet, always watching. After the murders stopped, people whispered about him being involved, but there was never enough evidence. Then he vanished in 1947, and the whispers got louder. Some said he'd run away. Others said he'd killed himself out of guilt, and a few believed he was still around somehow, haunting the places where the violence occurred. Ethel said she personally believed Vance was the Phantom and that whatever happened to him after he disappeared wasn't natural. I spent about an hour with Ethel, and by the end she looked exhausted. Before I left, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and pulled me close. You need to understand something. Writing about this, talking to people, visiting those places, it wakes things up. You're shining a light into darkness that prefers to stay hidden. If strange things start happening to you, it's because you've been marked as someone who knows too much. I tried to laugh it off, told her I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, but she just shook her head. You will, she said. Before this is over, you will. I thanked her for her time and left feeling deeply unsettled, her warning echoing in my mind. I drove back toward the campground around 4 p.m. and on impulse decided to make a detour past the old Starlight Drive-In. I'd read about it in forum posts and paranormal blogs, how it was supposedly haunted, and I wanted to see it for myself. The place was even more desolate than I'd expected, that massive screen still standing like a tombstone, the parking lot overtaken by weeds, speaker posts rising up like grave markers. I parked near the entrance and walked in, camera in hand, planning to take some atmospheric shots for my article. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, and the whole place had this oppressive silence to it, like sound didn't travel right here. I was photographing the old concession stand when I noticed a car parked in the lot, a dark blue Impala, probably from the early 70s. I hadn't seen it when I drove in, but there it was, sitting in the middle of the lot like it belonged there. I walked toward it, curious, and as I got closer I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat. A man, wearing what looked like a dark jacket and a hat. I called out, asked if he was the owner of the property, but got no response. I approached the driver's side window and looked in, and my heart stopped. The man inside was the same one who'd come to my trailer last night. Same old suit, same intense eyes, but now I could see details I'd missed in the darkness. His skin was wrong, too pale, almost gray, and his suit wasn't just old-fashioned, it was actually deteriorating, threads coming apart, fabric stained and moth-eaten. He turned his head slowly to look at me, and his lips moved like he was speaking, but I couldn't hear any sound through the closed window. I backed away, and that's when I realized I could see through him, just slightly, just enough to make out the passenger seat behind his translucent form. He wasn't real. He wasn't alive. Whatever I was looking at was something else entirely. The figure raised his hand and pointed at me, just like he'd done at my trailer door last night, and his mouth kept moving in that silent speech. I stumbled backward and fell, landing hard on the pavement, and when I looked up again the car was gone. Completely vanished. Just empty parking lot where it had been seconds before. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to my SUV, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I peeled out of that parking lot and drove straight back to Pinewood Trails, my mind racing. What Ethel had said about waking things up by investigating, it was happening. I was experiencing exactly what she'd warned me about. Carol's RV was already parked near my Airstream when I got back, and I practically ran to her door and knocked. She let me in, took one look at my face, and immediately asked what happened. I told her everything. The figure at the drive-in, how it was the same man from last night, how he'd vanished along with the car. I expected her to think I was losing my mind, but instead she just nodded grimly like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Carol made me sit down and poured me a glass of whiskey, which I normally don't drink, but right then I needed it. She sat across from me and said she had something to tell me, something she'd kept quiet about for years because admitting it made her sound crazy. Back in 1989, when she'd first bought the campground property, she'd had her own encounter. She'd been staying in a temporary trailer on the land while renovating the facilities, and one night she heard arguing outside, a man and woman's voices, escalating into screaming. She'd gone out to investigate and found nothing, but the voices continued for hours, moving around the property like they were circling. Then she'd seen them, translucent figures, a couple dressed in 40s clothing, fighting violently near the tree line. The woman was crying, begging, and the man was enraged. Carol watched them for maybe 30 seconds before they both vanished. She'd done research after that and discovered that in 1946, there'd been a couple, James and Dorothy Hendricks, who'd gotten into a fight at a party near this property. James had driven Dorothy out here to what was then just empty woods, and they'd been found the next morning by a farmer. Both were dead in the car, throats slashed. Another phantom attack that wasn't widely reported because it didn't fit the pattern exactly and the police weren't sure it was connected. But Carol believed it was, and she believed their trauma had soaked into this land the same way it had soaked into Spring Lake Park and the drive-in and every other place the violence touched. She said she'd learned to ignore the occasional strange sounds over the years, had convinced herself it was all in her head, but hearing my story confirmed what she'd always suspected. This whole area was haunted by 1946. I asked her why she didn't just leave, sell the property, get away from it. Carol said she'd thought about it many times, but the truth was she felt protective of this place now. Like if she left, something worse might happen. At least she could warn people, keep an eye on things, make sure nobody got hurt. She'd turned away several paranormal investigation groups over the years because she didn't want them stirring things up worse than they already were. She looked at me seriously and said, "Kelsey, I think you need to stop this article. What you're doing, all this digging into the past, it's feeding whatever's here. It's getting stronger because you're giving it attention." I wanted to argue, wanted to say that as a journalist I had a responsibility to tell these stories, but deep down I knew she was right. That night, Carol stayed in her RV parked right next to my Airstream, and I felt safer knowing she was close. But safe is relative when you're dealing with things you don't understand. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to my trailer shaking, not violently, but like someone was pushing against the outside, making it rock gently back and forth. I could hear that whistling again, louder now, coming from multiple directions like there were several people surrounding my trailer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointed it at the windows. Shadows moved outside, humanoid shapes passing back and forth, and I could hear voices, not arguing this time, but whispering. Dozens of overlapping whispers I couldn't make out individual words from. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. Worse than any war zone I'd reported from. Worse than any crime scene I'd visited. The shaking and whispers continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then everything stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I waited, barely breathing, for something else to happen. Instead, I heard Carol shouting my name from outside. I opened my door and found her standing in her pajamas, looking terrified. She said the same thing had happened to her RV. The shaking, the whispers, the shadows. We were both being targeted now, both being warned or threatened or whatever the hell this was. Carol said we needed to leave the campground immediately, that staying here tonight was dangerous. We quickly gathered essentials, hitched up our respective trailers, and drove out to a Walmart parking lot on the outskirts of town, somewhere well-lit and populated. We sat in Carol's RV in that Walmart parking lot until sunrise, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what was happening. Carol suggested I abandon the article entirely, leave Texarkana, and never come back. Part of me wanted to do exactly that, just chalk this up as the one story that beat me and go home. But another part, the stubborn journalist part, was angry. I'd been threatened, harassed, and terrorized by something I didn't even fully believe in 2 days ago, and now I was supposed to just slink away? I told Carol I needed one more day. I wanted to go back to the library, dig deeper into Earl Vance's history, try to understand what he'd done that could cause this kind of lasting paranormal activity. If I was going to quit, I wanted to at least understand what I was quitting on. Carol tried to talk me out of it, but eventually she saw I wasn't going to be convinced otherwise. She made me promise I'd stay in public places, wouldn't go anywhere isolated, and would text her every hour to check in. I agreed to her terms, and as soon as the library opened at 9 a.m., I was there. Dennis seemed surprised to see me back, especially when I asked specifically for anything related to Earl Vance. He pulled up some old city directories, employment records, census data. Vance had lived alone in a house near Spring Lake Park, had worked multiple jobs around town, had no family anyone knew about. But here's what caught my attention. In 1947, right before he disappeared, Vance had checked out a bunch of books from the library. Dennis showed me the old circulation cards, still on file. The books were about occult practices, summoning rituals, and something called psychic imprinting. I asked Dennis if I could see those books, and he checked the system. They were all still in the library's collection, down in the archives. He brought them up for me. These ancient hardcovers with cracked spines and yellowed pages. I started reading, and what I found made everything click into place in the most horrifying way possible. Psychic imprinting was this theory that extreme emotional events, especially violent ones, could leave permanent marks on physical locations, like recording trauma onto the environment itself. But one of the books went further, describing rituals that could intentionally bind a person's consciousness to a place, making them a permanent guardian or prisoner of that location even after death. The ritual required the person to spill their own blood at multiple sites meaningful to them, speak specific words, and maintain absolute focus on their desire to remain. Earl Vance had read these books right before he disappeared. I was suddenly certain, absolutely certain, that Vance had performed this ritual. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of some twisted desire to stay connected to his crimes. But he'd bound himself to Texarkana. He was still here, not as a ghost exactly, but as something worse, an intentional haunting, a consciousness that had chosen to remain tethered to this town forever. And by researching him, by visiting the locations, by interviewing people about the murders, I'd activated him somehow. I'd made him aware of me, and now he was trying to drive me away, or worse, trying to add me to his collection of permanent victims. I texted Carol immediately. I know what's happening. Meet me at Betty's Diner in 30 minutes. We need to leave Texarkana today. I waited for her response, but none came. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I gathered up the books, checked them out officially from the library, and drove to the Walmart where we parked earlier. Carol's RV was gone, just an empty parking space where it had been this morning. I called the campground landline, no answer. I drove to Betty's Diner hoping maybe she'd gone there early, but she wasn't there either. I sat in a booth, my hands shaking, trying to figure out what to do. That's when the waitress from my first visit approached my table. She set down a piece of paper without saying anything and walked away. I unfolded it, and my blood turned to ice. In that same shaky handwriting from the note at Spring Lake Park, it read, "Your friend Carol is with us now. You're next unless you stop. Burn the books. Leave tonight. This is your final warning." I looked around the diner wildly, trying to see who'd given the waitress this note, but everyone looked normal, just regular people eating lunch, nobody paying attention to me. I ran out to my SUV, threw the library books in the passenger seat, and started driving. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to move, needed to think. I tried Carol's number again and again, nothing. I called the police, reported her missing, but they said she hadn't been gone long enough to file a report and maybe she'd just gone somewhere without telling me. I wanted to scream at them, tell them about the supernatural horror stalking us, but I knew how that would sound. Instead, I drove to every location I could think of, the campground, the drive-in, Spring Lake Park. No sign of Carol anywhere. It was like she'd been erased. By late afternoon, I was parked outside a gas station, crying from frustration and fear when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered and heard Carol's voice, but wrong, distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Kelsey, help me. I'm at Vance's house. He won't let me leave. Please." Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at my phone, and I absolutely knew, that this was a trap. Vance, or whatever Vance had become, wanted me to come to his property. He was using Carol as bait. But what choice did I have? I couldn't just abandon her. I pulled up the address from my research notes, plugged it into my GPS, and started driving toward the place I'd sworn I'd never go. Earl Vance's house near Spring Lake Park, the epicenter of all this darkness. The house was exactly as I'd imagined from descriptions, a collapsed, vine-covered ruin hidden in overgrown woods. I parked on the road and approached on foot, calling Carol's name. No response. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I had maybe 30 minutes of daylight left. I found a path through the undergrowth and followed it to what had been the front door. The interior was destroyed, but I could see stairs leading down to a basement. Of course, it would be in the basement. I turned on my phone's flashlight and descended carefully, every instinct screaming at me to run. The basement was exactly as other people had described in online posts. Dirt walls carved with faces, ritual circles made of bones, and in fresh dirt on the floor. "Welcome home." Then I heard Carol's voice behind me. "I tried to warn you." I spun around, and she was standing at the bottom of the stairs, but her eyes were empty, vacant, and that horrible whistle was coming from her mouth even though her lips weren't moving. She wasn't Carol anymore. She was something Vance was using, something he'd taken. More figures appeared in the shadows around me. The young couple from the drive-in, the man in the hood, other shapes I couldn't quite make out. They all moved closer, surrounding me, and I understood with perfect clarity that I wasn't leaving this basement. I'd become part of the story I'd tried to tell, another victim of the phantom's endless, hungry darkness. My last thought before everything went black was that I should have listened. I should have left Texarkana when I had the chance. Some stories aren't meant to be told because telling them makes you part of them. And now I was. My name is Garrett Pullman. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd been doing the van life thing for about 3 years when this happened. Renovated a 1998 Ford Econoline myself, solar panels on top, the whole setup. My girlfriend Miranda, she's 38, a photographer who'd been documenting our travels across the Southwest. We'd heard about Marfa, Texas. You know, that weird artist town in the middle of nowhere with the mysterious lights everyone talks about. Miranda was obsessed with getting shots of those lights, said it could make her portfolio. So we drove out there in late September when the desert heat finally breaks. The drive through West Texas is something else, man. It's like the land itself is trying to tell you to turn around. Miles and miles of nothing but scrub brush and those distant mountains that never seem to get closer. We stopped at a gas station in some tiny town. I can't even remember the name. And this old guy pumping diesel next to us just stared at our van for a solid minute before saying, "Y'all be careful out there. Things ain't right this time of year." Miranda laughed it off, thought he was playing up the local folklore for tourists. I didn't laugh though. Something about the way he said it, the way his eyes looked past us rather than at us, that stuck with me. But we were committed, had driven 6 hours already, and Miranda had this whole plan mapped out. We rolled into Marfa around sunset, and I'll admit, the place had this disturbing kind of beauty to it. The light hits different out there in the high desert, makes everything look like it's from another time. We grabbed dinner at this hipster restaurant, $12 tacos and craft beer, then drove out toward the Marfa Lights viewing area. But here's the thing. Miranda wanted to get closer to where people actually reported seeing the lights, not just sit at the tourist spot with a bunch of other people. She'd done her research, found some Bureau of Land Management road that locals used, said we could boondock out there for the night. Free camping, total darkness for her long exposure shots, and a better chance of seeing something weird. I should have said no right then. Should have insisted we stay at the RV park in town. But I didn't. The BLM road was rougher than we expected, and my van isn't exactly a four-wheel drive beast. We bounced along for maybe 3 miles, rocks pinging off the undercarriage, until we found this flat area near some scraggly mesquite trees. The sun had just dropped below the horizon, and that eerie twilight thing was happening where the sky goes purple and you can't quite see clearly anymore. Miranda was already setting up her tripod outside, adjusting her camera settings, talking about aperture and ISO, photography stuff I never fully understood. I started our little propane heater inside the van because desert nights get cold fast, then joined her outside. The silence out there was scary in a way I'd never experienced before. No cars, no insects, no wind. Just this heavy, pressing quiet that made my ears ring. We waited for maybe an hour, drinking lukewarm coffee from our thermos, watching the stars come out in that overwhelming way they do when you're far from city lights. Miranda was getting antsy, kept checking her phone even though we had no signal, muttering about cloud cover and moon phase. Then she saw it, a light in the distance, maybe 2 miles out, hovering maybe 10 feet off the ground. It was yellowish white, pulsing slowly, and it didn't move like a car headlight or aircraft. "That's it," she whispered, her voice cracking with excitement. "That's one of them." She started snapping photos, her camera shutter clicking rapid fire. I watched that light, and I gotta tell you, something felt wrong about it. Not wrong like, oh wow, mysterious, but wrong like when you're a kid and you know something bad is in your closet, but you can't see it yet. The light started moving, not toward us, but parallel, like it was pacing. After about 20 minutes, the light just vanished. Didn't fade, didn't move over the horizon, just gone, like someone flipped a switch. Miranda was reviewing her photos on her camera screen, practically vibrating with excitement, saying she got incredible shots. I suggested we head back to the van and call it a night, but she wanted to wait longer, see if more appeared. That's when we heard it. Not a footstep or a strange sound, but a voice. A woman's voice, distant but clear enough that we both heard it, calling out, "Help me," from somewhere in that vast darkness beyond our van. Miranda grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. The voice came again, closer this time, more desperate. "Please, help me." And that's when every instinct I had started screaming at me to get in the van and drive. Miranda was already moving toward the sound, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Wait," I hissed, grabbing her shoulder, but she shrugged me off. "Someone's hurt out there, Garrett. We can't just ignore it." But here's the thing, that voice didn't sound hurt. It sounded wrong, like someone doing a bad impression of being in distress. The tone was off, too flat, too mechanical. I've heard people in actual trouble before, help pull a guy from a flipped car outside Sedona once, and real panic sounds different. This was like listening to a recording of someone saying the words without feeling them. Still, Miranda had this fierce empathy thing, always stopping for stranded motorists, always the first to help. I couldn't let her go out there alone, so I grabbed my own flashlight and followed, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. We walked maybe 50 yards from the van, our lights bouncing over the rocky ground and dead brush. The temperature had dropped fast, and I could see my breath now, these little clouds that disappeared into the blackness. "Hello," Miranda called out. "Where are you? We want to help." Nothing. Just that oppressive silence again, and I swear the air felt thicker somehow, harder to breathe. Then the voice came from a completely different direction, behind us now, back toward the van. "Help me, please." Miranda spun around, her lights sweeping wildly. "How did she started to say, but didn't finish. We both understood what that meant. Either someone was messing with us, or something was very, very wrong. I grabbed Miranda's wrist this time, held tight. "We're going back to the van. Now." For once, she didn't argue. We hustled back, and I kept my light pointed behind us the whole way, expecting to see, I don't know what. Someone following us, maybe. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the occasional gleam of our van's white paint catching our flashlight beams. We reached it, and I practically shoved Miranda inside, slamming the door behind us and hitting the lock button. She was breathing hard, her face pale in the dim glow from our LED strip lights. "What the hell was that?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. I started the engine, just wanted it running, ready to go, and turned on the headlights. They illuminated maybe 30 feet of desert in front of us. And beyond that, nothing but a wall of black. That's when we noticed something disturbing about our surroundings. There were shapes out there, just at the edge of our headlight range. Dark, vertical shapes that could have been people standing still, or could have been just shadows from the mesquite trees. Except I didn't remember trees being in that exact spot. Miranda had her camera up, zooming in on the shapes through the viewfinder. "They're not moving," she said quietly, "just standing there." She snapped a few photos with the flash, and for that split second when the flash went off, I saw them clearly. There were 4 of them, and they were definitely human-shaped, but something about their proportions was off. Too tall maybe, or too thin. Before I could process it, the flash faded and they were just silhouettes again. "Show me the photos," I demanded. She turned the camera screen toward me, clicking through the images. In every single one, the shapes were blurred, like they'd moved during the exposure, but we'd both seen them standing still. It was like the camera couldn't quite capture whatever they were. My hands were shaking now, and I put the van in reverse, ready to back down that rough road in the dark if I had to. "Wait," Miranda said, pointing. The shapes were moving now, but not toward us. They were moving around us, circling at that same distance from the van, staying just at the edge of where our headlights reached. I counted them, still 4, spaced evenly apart, moving in sync like they were connected somehow. "This is insane," I muttered, cranking the wheel to turn the van around. That's when the engine died, just cut out completely, and the headlights with it. We were plunged into absolute darkness except for the small LED lights inside the van. I turned the key, nothing. Tried again, not even a click from the starter. No, I said, my voice rising. I'm pretty handy with engines. Had replaced the alternator myself 6 months ago, and this van had been running perfectly all day. Miranda grabbed my arm again, and when I looked at her, her eyes were wide and fixed on something behind me, through the back windows of the van. I turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, pale and distorted in the LED light, but what made it scary What made it truly horrifying was that the face was upside down, like someone was hanging from the roof of my van, dangling down to peer inside at us. The eyes were too large, the mouth stretched into this impossible grin that showed too many teeth. Miranda started screaming, a raw, primal sound that filled the van, and I lunged for the driver's seat, turning the key again and again, pumping the gas pedal like that would help. The face tilted its head, still upside down, and tapped one long finger against the glass. Tap, 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 like it was asking to be let in. That's when the other three appeared at the other windows, all around us, all upside down, all wearing that same disturbing grin. The van roared to life on my next try, and I didn't question it, just slammed it into drive and floored the accelerator. We lurched forward, rocks and brush scraping the undercarriage, and I kept my foot down even though I could barely see where I was going. The headlights had come back on with the engine, thank God, but they were flickering, casting these strobing shadows that made everything look like a nightmare flipbook. Miranda had stopped screaming but was making these small whimpering sounds, her hands pressed against her mouth. I glanced in the side mirror and saw them, all four of those things, standing in a line where we'd been parked, watching us go. They weren't chasing us, weren't moving at all now, just standing there like mannequins someone had arranged in the desert. That somehow made it worse, the stillness of them, the patience. We bounced along that BLM road for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, and I didn't slow down until we hit the paved highway. My whole body was shaking, adrenaline making my vision sharp and weird. Miranda finally spoke, her voice hoarse. What were those things? I shook my head because I genuinely didn't know. They looked human but moved wrong, existed wrong, like something had studied people but didn't quite understand how we're supposed to work. We need to report this, she said, pulling out her phone. Still no signal. Of course not. We were still in the middle of nowhere, between Marfa and the next town. I kept driving, pushing the van faster than I probably should have on that dark highway, checking my mirrors every few seconds to make sure nothing was following us. We made it to Marfa around midnight, and the town was dead, streets empty, most buildings dark except for a few vintage streetlights casting yellow pools on the sidewalk. I pulled into the parking lot of a closed art gallery, finally letting myself breathe. We sat there for maybe 20 minutes, neither of us speaking, just processing. Miranda was reviewing her photos again, zooming in on those blurred shapes, and I noticed her hands were trembling. Look at this, she said, turning the screen toward me. She'd zoomed way in on one of the figures, and even through the blur, you could see details that made my skin crawl. The thing had fingers, but they were too long, segmented in too many places, like someone had added extra joints. Its neck was wrong too, bent at an angle that would have broken a normal person's spine. I wanted to drive straight through, get out of Texas completely, but I was exhausted and scared I'd fall asleep at the wheel. We decided to find the RV park, pay for a spot, be around other people and lights. The park was on the edge of town, just a gravel lot with electrical hookups and a sad little bathhouse. There were maybe 6 other rigs there, all dark and quiet. We pulled into a spot between a massive fifth wheel and a small Class C motorhome, and I immediately plugged into shore power, turned on every exterior light my van had. Miranda made us instant ramen on the camp stove, and we ate in silence, the scary thing about the situation finally sinking in. We'd seen something out there that didn't make sense, something that my rational brain couldn't categorize or explain away. Around 2 in the morning, I finally convinced Miranda to try to sleep. We had blackout curtains on all the windows, necessary for sleeping during the day sometimes, and I pulled them all closed, creating this little cocoon inside the van. She curled up in our bed at the back, still fully clothed, and I lay down next to her. I didn't think I'd be able to sleep, but exhaustion won out, and I drifted off listening to the hum of our small fan. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up to Miranda shaking me, her hand clamped over my mouth to keep me from making noise. Listen, she breathed in my ear. I did. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then I caught it. Footsteps outside the van, multiple sets, walking around us in a slow circle, just like those things had done out in the desert. I carefully pulled back the corner of one curtain, just an inch, and peeked out. The RV park looked different somehow wrong. The other vehicles were still there, but something about their position seemed off, like they'd been moved slightly while we slept. And there were people standing between the rigs, at least 8 or 9 of them that I could see. all perfectly still, all facing our van. They were normal-looking people this time, not those stretched-out things from before, but there was something disturbing about their synchronization, the way they all stood with their arms at their sides in the exact same position. One was a woman in a nightgown, one was an older man in a trucker cap, one was a kid who couldn't have been more than 12. Their eyes reflected our exterior lights like animals' eyes, little points of brightness in the darkness. And as I watched, they all tilted their heads to the side at exactly the same angle, exactly the same time, like puppets controlled by the same string. I let the curtain fall back and looked at Miranda, her face barely visible in the darkness of the van. "We need to leave," I whispered. "Right now." She nodded, and we moved as quietly as possible, me sliding into the driver's seat while she stayed low in the back. I didn't turn on any interior lights, didn't make a sound, just reached for the ignition key with trembling fingers. The engine turned over on the first try, and the second it did, all those people outside moved at once. Not toward us. They scattered in different directions, disappearing between the RVs and into the shadows so fast it didn't seem human. I threw the van into reverse, didn't bother unhooking from the electrical post, just ripped the cord right out and backed up fast enough that gravel sprayed everywhere. We tore out of that RV park doing maybe 40, which is insane for a gravel lot, but I didn't care. Hit the highway and went north toward Fort Stockton, figuring we'd drive until sunrise, until we were out of this weird pocket of Texas where nothing made sense. Miranda climbed up front into the passenger seat, buckled in, and pulled her knees up to her chest. "Those were regular people," she said. "Like, they looked completely normal. What if we just freaked out over nothing? What if they were just other campers?" I shook my head hard. "Did you see how they moved? All at the same time. That wasn't nothing." But doubt was creeping in now. Maybe we were losing it. Maybe the stress and fear from the desert encounter had made us paranoid. Maybe we just abandoned a perfectly safe campground because our nerves were shot. About 20 miles up the highway, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Single vehicle, coming up fast. Real fast. I was already doing 75, and this thing was gaining on us like we were standing still. "Someone's coming," I told Miranda, and she twisted around to look. The headlights were high up, a truck maybe, or an SUV, and they were close enough now that the light flooded our van interior. Then the vehicle backed off a bit, matching our speed, just following us. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. Could be nothing, could be a coincidence, could be someone else just driving north in the middle of the night. But after everything that had happened, I wasn't big on coincidences anymore. I sped up to 85. The vehicle behind us sped up too, maintaining that same distance. "Try your phone," I said to Miranda. She grabbed it, and her face lit up in the screen glow. "I've got signal. 2 bars. She immediately dialed 911, and I could hear it ringing once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered, but it wasn't the usual emergency operator greeting. It was that same flat, mechanical woman's voice from the desert. "Help me. Please help me." Miranda dropped the phone like it had burned her, and I heard that voice still coming from the speaker, repeating the same 2 phrases over and over. I reached over, grabbed the phone, and threw it out the window. Maybe that was stupid, maybe we'd need it later, but I couldn't stand hearing that voice anymore. The truck behind us flashed its high beams, once, twice, 3 times, and then suddenly accelerated, pulling into the left lane like it was going to pass us. As it came alongside, I tried not to look, tried to just focus on the road ahead, but Miranda was staring at it. "Garrett," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Don't look at the driver." Of course I looked. I couldn't help it. The truck was a big Ford F-350, jacked up with off-road tires, and behind the wheel was one of those upside-down things from the desert, its impossible grin visible even through the tinted window. It waved at us, a slow, deliberate wave, and then the truck suddenly swerved right, trying to force us off the road. I cranked the wheel hard, felt the van tilt sickeningly to the left, 2 wheels probably lifting off the pavement. We scraped against the guardrail in a shower of sparks, metal screaming, and I fought to keep us upright. The truck dropped back, and I floored it, pushing my old van to its absolute limit. The engine was screaming, probably doing 95, and I could smell something burning, oil or rubber or both. Miranda was crying now, these silent tears just streaming down her face, and I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't take my hands off the wheel. Up ahead, I saw lights, a gas station, thank God, one of those big truck stops with multiple pumps and a 24-hour convenience store. I took the exit way too fast, felt the van shimmy and almost roll, but made it onto the off-ramp. Pulled into the truck stop and parked right under the brightest lights I could find, next to the building where there were security cameras visible. The truck that had been chasing us didn't follow. I watched the highway, watched the exit ramp, but it never appeared. It was like it had just vanished the moment we turned off. We sat in the van for a solid 10 minutes before either of us could move, just watching the highway through the windshield, waiting for that truck to reappear. It didn't. The truck stop was busy, several big rigs idling in the parking lot, a few cars at the pumps, normal people doing normal things. It felt like we'd crossed back into the regular world, and that nightmare version of Texas we'd been stuck in had finally let us go. Miranda wiped her face and looked at me. "We need to tell someone. The police, somebody." I nodded, even though I had no idea what we'd actually say. "Hey officer, we saw some upside-down creatures and regular people who moved in sync." Yeah, that'd go over great. But we had to try. Inside the convenience store, the fluorescent lights were almost painfully bright after all that darkness. There was a tired-looking clerk behind the counter, maybe mid-50s, with a Texas Rangers cap and a name tag that said Dale. A couple of truckers were refilling their coffee at the machine, talking about road conditions and delivery schedules. Everything was so aggressively normal that I almost felt crazy for what we'd experienced. Miranda approached the counter while I grabbed a basket, figuring we should get some food and water while we were here. "Excuse me," Miranda said to Dale. "Is there a police station nearby? We need to report something." Dale looked up from his phone, gave us a once-over. "Sheriff's substation about 15 miles north in Fort Stockton." "What kind of something we talking about?" Miranda hesitated, and I saw her trying to figure out how to explain it without sounding insane. "We were camping out near Marfa, and some people, they were harassing us, following us. It was a sanitized version, but it was something." Dale frowned, scratched his jaw. "Out near Marfa, huh? You see them lights?" Miranda nodded. "Yeah, we saw something." Dale's expression changed then, got more serious. "Let me guess, you went off the main viewing area, try to get closer?" We both nodded. He sighed heavy, like he'd heard this story before. "Yeah, y'all ain't the first. We get folks come through here every few months, all spooked about something they saw out there. My advice? Keep driving, get out of West Texas, and don't come back. Whatever you saw, whatever followed you, it stays out here. It don't leave the area." That was disturbing as hell, the way he said it so matter-of-factly, like he was giving directions to a rest stop. "What do you mean it doesn't leave?" I asked, moving closer to the counter. Dale looked at both of us, and I could see he was deciding how much to say. "Look, I've lived here my whole life, 47 years. My daddy worked oil fields out in the basin, and he told me stories about things he'd see during night shifts. Things that look human but ain't. Things that mimic voices. The old-timers, the ranchers who've been out here for generations, they all know. You don't go out in the desert at night, not alone, not in small groups. You see something weird, you leave. That's it. That's the rule." One of the truckers had stopped pouring coffee and was listening now, nodding along like this was all common knowledge. "So what? Everyone just accepts this? Nobody does anything about it?" Miranda's voice was rising, getting that edge it got when she was angry scared. Dale shrugged. "What are we supposed to do? Call on the National Guard? Tell them there's something in the desert that science can't explain? We just live with it, same as our grandparents did. You're fine now. You made it to a public place with lights and people. Whatever was following you, it's gone. But if you're smart, you'll get on I-10 and drive west to El Paso or east to San Antonio. You don't stop, you don't camp anywhere remote, and you definitely don't go back to Marfa." He said it with such finality that I believed him. This wasn't a cop-out or local superstition. This was survival advice from someone who'd seen enough to know better. We bought water, gas station sandwiches, and energy drinks, then walked back to the van. The eastern sky was starting to lighten, that pre-dawn gray that meant we'd made it through the night. I felt exhausted in my bones, the kind of tired that comes from sustained fear. We decided to follow Dale's advice, get on I-10 and head west toward El Paso, then north to New Mexico, anywhere but here. I filled up the tank while Miranda sat in the passenger seat, staring at nothing. When I climbed back in, she said quietly, "I deleted all the photos. From tonight, from the desert. All of them. I understood. Some things weren't meant to be documented, weren't meant to be shared. Sometimes the only smart thing to do is destroy the evidence and pretend it never happened. We drove out of that truck stop as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the desert in orange and pink. It should have been beautiful, but all I could see was how exposed everything looked in daylight, how many places there were to hide between the rocks and brush. We hit I-10 westbound, and I set the cruise control at exactly the speed limit. Didn't want to get pulled over, didn't want any reason to stop. About an hour into the drive, Miranda fell asleep, her head against the window. I envied her that. I was too wired, too aware of every car that passed us, every vehicle in my mirrors. It took us another 6 hours to get to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and only when we crossed that state line did I finally feel like we'd escaped. We found a regular RV park, full hookups, security gate, families with kids riding bikes around. Normal. Safe. We stayed there for 3 days, barely leaving the van, just recovering. We never talked about what happened in Texas, not in any detail. It was like if we didn't discuss it, maybe it would fade, become less real. But I still have nightmares sometimes, about upside-down faces at the window, about that flat voice calling for help, about things in the darkness that move in perfect synchronization. And I never, ever want to see those Marfa lights again. My name is Lucinda Voss. I'm 51 years old, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've been a nurse for 26 years, worked in ICU for most of that, and honestly, I thought I'd seen everything. Death, trauma, the weird things the human body can survive. None of it fazed me anymore. When I took early retirement last year after my divorce finalized, I bought a used Winnebago Mini Winnie, something small I could handle on my own, and decided to spend a year just driving around, clearing my head. My daughter Simone, she's 29, thought I was having a breakdown. "Mom, you've never even been camping," she said when I told her. She wasn't wrong, but I needed this. Needed to be alone, needed to move, needed to not think about my ex-husband or that empty house in the suburbs. I'd been on the road for about 4 months when I decided to cut through Texas on my way to see my sister in Louisiana. Big mistake. I took Highway 90 through the southern part of the state. One of those routes that takes you through towns so small they barely show up on GPS. It was early October, still hot as hell during the day, but cooling off at night. I'd planned to stop in Del Rio, get a campsite, maybe walk along the lake. But I got a late start that morning, stopped too many times to take photos of the desert scenery, and by the time I was an hour outside Del Rio, the sun was already setting. That's when I saw the sign for Seminole Canyon State Park. I'd heard about it. Ancient pictographs, hiking trails, primitive camping spots. Figured I'd stay there for the night, save money on a full hookup site. The park entrance was off the main highway, down this winding road that dropped into a canyon. Beautiful in that stark, harsh way West Texas can be. I paid my fee at the self-service station, $12 for a primitive site, which meant no water, no electricity, just a flat spot to park. The ranger station was closed, it being almost 7 p.m., and there were only 2 other vehicles in the camping area when I pulled in. A small trailer that looked like it had been there a while, covered in dust, and a newer Sprinter van with Colorado plates. I picked a spot away from both of them, backed my Winnebago in, and set up my portable chair outside. The canyon walls rose up on both sides, these massive limestone cliffs that turned purple in the fading light. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you remember how loud your normal life is. I heated up some canned soup on my propane stove and ate watching the stars come out. There are so many more stars when you're away from cities. It's almost scary how many there are, like someone scattered diamonds across black velvet. I could hear coyotes yipping in the distance, which I'd gotten used to over the past few months. Nature sounds didn't bother me anymore. It was human sounds that made me nervous when I was alone. Around 9, I decided to turn in early, read my book in bed. I locked both doors on the RV, something I always did, and pulled the curtains. My Winnebago isn't fancy, but it's cozy, small kitchen, tiny bathroom with a shower, and a bed over the cab that I could barely crawl into with my bad knees. But it was mine, my little mobile sanctuary. I was maybe 3 chapters into my thriller novel when I heard voices outside. Male voices, at least 2 of them, talking quietly. I couldn't make out the words, but they were close, maybe 20 feet from my RV. I peeked through the curtain and saw flashlights, two beams moving around the camping area. Probably just the guys from the Sprinter van, I told myself. People walk around campgrounds at night all the time, using the bathroom, looking at stars, whatever. But something felt off about the way they were moving, methodical, like they were searching for something. One of the flashlight beams swept across my RV, and I ducked back from the window. My heart was doing this annoying flutter thing it sometimes did when I got anxious. I waited, listening. The voices faded, the flashlights moved away, and after about 10 minutes of silence, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. That's when I heard the scratching. Not on my door or windows, underneath the RV. Like someone or something was crawling around under there, their nails or fingernails dragging across the metal undercarriage. I froze in my bed, my book forgotten, every muscle tense. The scratching moved from the front to the back, slow and deliberate, and I could hear breathing now too, heavy and wet, like someone with a chest cold. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'm calling the Rangers." I didn't have cell service. I checked earlier, but whoever was out there didn't know that. The scratching stopped. The breathing stopped. Complete silence. I waited for maybe 5 minutes, not moving, barely breathing myself. Then I heard footsteps on my roof, right above my head, walking from back to front. Someone was on top of my RV, and the disturbing part was I hadn't heard them climb up there. The footsteps above me were slow, deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I grabbed my phone even though I knew it was useless without signal, and my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. The steps moved to the front of the RV, right over the cab, and then stopped. I heard a thump, like someone sitting down up there, and then nothing. Just silence. My mind was racing through options. I could try to drive away, but to do that I'd have to climb up into the cab, which would put me directly under whoever was on the roof. I could run to the Sprinter van, bang on their door, hope they'd help. Or I could just wait it out, hope this person got bored and left. None of these options felt safe, and that old ICU nurse instinct was telling me something was very wrong here. I decided to try calling out again, firmer this time. "I know you're up there. Get off my RV, or I'm calling the police." My voice sounded stronger than I felt, which was something. No response. Then I heard a different sound, tapping on the windshield, up in the cab area. Tap, 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 like someone knocking to be let in. But that was impossible. To reach the windshield from the roof, someone would have to be hanging upside down over the front of the RV, which would mean I didn't let myself finish that thought. "I have a gun," I yelled, which was a lie. I considered buying one before this trip, but never got around to it. The tapping stopped, and I heard movement again, footsteps crossing back over the roof toward the rear of the RV. That's when my RV started rocking. Not gently, like wind would cause, but violently, side to side, like someone was pushing it with serious force. Books fell off my small shelf, my coffee mug slid off the counter and shattered on the floor. I was thrown against the wall, my shoulder hitting hard enough to make me gasp. The rocking continued for maybe 30 seconds, and all I could do was brace myself and try not to panic. Then it stopped as suddenly as it started. I was breathing hard, my heart hammering, and I could taste copper in my mouth. I'd bitten my tongue during the shaking. In the sudden quiet, I heard an engine start. Not mine, another vehicle. I pulled back the curtain carefully and saw the Sprinter van's lights come on. They were leaving, pulling out of their spot fast, gravel spraying. "Wait!" I screamed, knowing they couldn't hear me. "Don't leave me here." But they were gone, taillights disappearing up the road toward the park exit. Now it was just me and that dusty old trailer and whoever or whatever was messing with my RV. I made a decision then. I was getting out of here, roof person or not. I climbed up into the cab area, my knees protesting, and slid into the driver's seat. I didn't look at the windshield, didn't want to see if there was a face pressed against it. Just turned the key in the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then died. I tried again. Nothing. "No, no, no," I muttered, pumping the gas pedal like my dad taught me years ago with our old Chevy. The engine coughed, sputtered, but wouldn't catch. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement at the driver's side window. I turned my head, couldn't help it, and there was a face looking in at me. A man's face, maybe 40 years old, completely ordinary except for his eyes. They were wrong somehow. The pupils too large, taking up almost the whole iris. He smiled at me, and his teeth were filed to points, every single one of them sharp like a dog's. He raised one hand and waved, and I saw his fingernails were way too long, curved like claws, with dirt caked underneath them. I screamed and tried the ignition again, and this time the engine roared to life. I threw it in drive and hit the gas without even turning on my headlights, just desperate to move. The RV lurched forward and I cranked the wheel, aiming for the exit road. In my side mirror, I could see him standing where I'd been parked, just watching me go, that smile still on his face. But then I saw others emerging from the darkness. 3, 4, maybe 5 more people, all converging on where my RV had been. They weren't running, just walking with this weird synchronized pace. And in the moonlight, I could see they all had those same wrong eyes, those same pointed teeth. I pushed the accelerator harder, my old Winnebago shaking and groaning as I took the curves of the canyon road way too fast. Behind me, I could see flashlights coming up the road, and I realized those were the same lights I'd seen earlier, the same voices I'd heard. They'd been hunting, and I'd almost been their prey. I made it to the main highway and hung a right toward Del Rio, my hands death gripping the steering wheel. The Winnebago wasn't built for speed. It topped out around 65 and felt like it might shake apart at that. But I kept my foot down anyway. My mind was trying to process what I'd just seen, those people with the filed teeth and those disturbing eyes, and I kept checking my mirrors expecting to see headlights chasing me. Nothing. Just empty dark highway stretching behind me. After about 10 miles, I started to calm down enough to think rationally. I needed to get somewhere public, somewhere with lights and other people. Del Rio was still 40 minutes away, but there had to be something between here and there, a gas station or rest stop or something. My headlights caught a sign. Comstock, 8 miles. I'd never heard of it, but any town was better than being alone on this highway. I took the exit when it came up and immediately knew something was off. The road into town was cracked and potted, weeds growing up through the asphalt. The first few buildings I passed were abandoned, a boarded-up gas station, a house with the roof caved in, a small store with broken windows. But there were lights ahead, so I kept going. Downtown Comstock, if you could call it that, was maybe 3 blocks long. There was a bar with a flickering neon sign that said Oasis, a tiny post office that was dark, and a building that might have been a motel at some point. A few pickup trucks were parked outside the bar, which meant people, which meant safety. I pulled my RV into the gravel lot next to the bar and sat there for a minute, trying to steady my breathing. Through the bar's dirty windows, I could see figures moving around inside, hear the faint thump of country music. Normal people doing normal things on a Tuesday night. I locked the RV and walked to the bar entrance, and when I pushed open the door, every head turned to look at me. There were maybe 8 people inside, all men, all locals by the look of them, ranging from mid-20s to elderly. The bartender, a heavy-set guy with a gray beard, stopped mid-pour. "Help you?" he asked, not unfriendly but not exactly welcoming either. I realized I must have looked like hell, wild-eyed, hair a mess, probably bruises forming on my shoulder from being thrown around. "I need to use a phone," I said, my voice coming out shaky. "Or does anyone have cell service? I need to call the Rangers, or the police, or someone." One of the younger guys at the bar laughed, not meanly, just like I'd said something funny. "Ain't no cell service in Comstock, lady. Hasn't been for years. Tower got struck by lightning and nobody ever fixed it." The bartender gestured to an old rotary phone on the wall behind the bar. "You can use that if you want. Local calls only, though." I walked over on shaky legs and picked up the receiver. Dial tone. I tried to remember the number for emergency services in Texas, realized I was being stupid. It was still 911. I dialed it, and the phone just rang and rang. No answer. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. "Lines are funny out here sometimes," the bartender said, watching me. "What's got you so spooked anyway?" I turned to face them all, and the words just tumbled out. I was camping at Seminole Canyon, and these people, they had filed teeth and weird eyes, and they were on my RV, and I stopped because I saw the expressions changing on their faces. Not disbelief, but something worse. Recognition. Fear. The elderly man at the end of the bar, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, spoke up. "You saw the hollow folks." He said it simply, like he was identifying a type of bird. "Jesus, Ed, don't start with that," one of the other men said, but Ed ignored him. "That's what my granddaddy called them. Been in these parts long as anyone can remember. They live in the caves out in the canyon, Come out at night. The bartender poured me a whiskey without asking, slid it across the bar. On the house. You look like you need it. I took it, drank it in one gulp, even though I don't usually drink hard liquor, felt it burn down my throat. What do you mean, hollow folks? What are they? Ed shrugged his bony shoulders. Nobody knows exactly. Some say they used to be regular people who got lost in the caves and changed somehow. Others say they've always been here. Were here before the Comanche, before the Spanish even. They don't like outsiders camping in their territory. Most times they just scare people off. Sometimes. He trailed off, and I didn't need him to finish that sentence. Sometimes people didn't make it out. The scary implication hung in the air like smoke. You need to keep moving, the bartender said seriously. Don't stay in Comstock tonight. Get to Del Rio, stay at a regular RV park with lots of people around. The hollow folks, they don't go into big towns, don't like crowds or bright lights. You'll be safe there. I wanted to argue, wanted to say I was too tired to drive anymore. But looking at their faces, I knew they were right. Whatever those things were back at the canyon, whatever this bizarre nightmare was that I'd stumbled into, it wasn't over yet. I thanked them, declined the offer of a second drink, and headed back to my RV. As I climbed in, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were scratches on the driver's side door, fresh ones, like someone had dragged their fingernails down the metal in long, deliberate gouges. I got back on Highway 90 and pushed the Winnebago as hard as it would go, my eyes flicking between the road and my mirrors every few seconds. The scratches on my door kept flashing in my mind. Someone had been at my RV while I was in that bar, maybe watching me through the window, waiting. The highway was empty at this hour, no other headlights in either direction, just me and the darkness and the occasional armadillo frozen in my headlights before scuttling off into the brush. My phone still showed no service, and I kept glancing at it like that might change, like suddenly I'd get bars and could call Simone, hear her voice telling me I was going to be okay, that I'd just drive straight to her apartment in Austin and forget this whole thing. About 15 miles outside Del Rio, my headlights started flickering. Just little stutters at first, then longer blackouts where I'd be driving blind for 2 or 3 seconds before they came back on. Not now, I said out loud. Smacking the dashboard like that might help. I knew it was probably just a loose connection. The RV was old, things rattled loose all the time, but the timing was too perfect, too much like what had happened at the canyon when my engine died. The lights flickered again, stayed off for a full 5 seconds, and when they came back on, there was someone standing in the middle of the road. I screamed and slammed on the brakes, the RV shuddering and fishtailing, and I barely managed to keep it on the pavement. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stood there in my headlights. It was a woman, maybe 30 years old, wearing a dirty white dress that looked like it was from another era, the kind of thing you'd see in an old Western photograph. Her hair hung down over her face, and she was barefoot. I laid on the horn, a long blast that echoed across the empty desert. She finally moved, but not away. She tilted her head up, and her hair fell back, and I saw her face. Same wrong eyes, pupils like black holes. Same pointed teeth showing in a grin. She started walking toward my RV, slow and steady, and I threw the transmission into reverse, not even caring if another car came up behind me. I backed up maybe 50 feet, then cranked the wheel and drove around her, giving her as wide a berth as the two-lane highway allowed. As I passed, she turned to follow me with her eyes, that grin never changing, and I saw there were more of them. Standing just off the road in the darkness, maybe a dozen or more, all watching me go by. Some were men, some women, one looked like a teenager. All with those same features, those same predatory smiles. They didn't chase me, didn't move at all, just stood there like they were marking territory, letting me know I was in their space. I kept driving, my whole body shaking now, adrenaline making everything feel sharp and unreal. The lights of Del Rio finally appeared on the horizon. Beautiful, normal city lights, and I could have cried with relief. Civilization. Safety. Other people who weren't hollow folks, or whatever the hell those things were. I found a Walmart with an RV-friendly parking lot and pulled in next to a couple of other motorhomes, parked under the brightest light I could find. It was almost 1 in the morning, but the store was still open, 24 hours, God bless America, and there were people coming and going with shopping carts. I sat in my RV for a long time, just watching normal people do normal things, letting that normalcy wash over me like medicine. Eventually, I got out and walked into the Walmart. Not to buy anything really, just to be around people, to hear the music and the beep of scanners and a mother telling her kid they couldn't have candy. I bought a cup of terrible coffee from the McDonald's inside and sat in the little dining area, and nobody looked at me funny. Nobody had weird eyes or pointed teeth. Around 3 a.m., I went back to my RV and actually slept, exhausted enough that even fear couldn't keep me awake. I woke up at 8 to the sound of shopping carts and car doors, sunlight streaming through my curtains, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then I saw my phone on the counter, picked it up, and had full service. 12 texts from Simone asking where I was and if I was okay. I called her, and when she answered, I started crying before I could even say hello. Mom? Mom, what's wrong? She sounded panicked, and I tried to pull myself together. I'm okay, honey. I'm in Del Rio. I'm coming to Austin. I'm done with this trip. I just want to come stay with you for a while. She didn't ask questions, just said, okay, yes, come now. Drive safe. I wanted to leave Texas, wanted to get on the road immediately, but I needed to check my RV first, make sure it was safe to drive. I walked around it in the bright morning sun, looking at the scratches on the door. They were real, not imagined. Deep gouges in the metal that would have taken serious strength to make. I checked the tires, the undercarriage, the roof, and everything seemed mechanically sound. But when I climbed up to check the roof rack, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints up there, bare footprints in the dust and grime, and they weren't from shoes or boots. They were human feet, but the toes were too long, the proportions all wrong, like someone had stretched a normal footprint by a few inches. And there were handprints too, next to where someone would have been hanging over the front windshield. And those hands had 6 fingers each instead of 5. I climbed down from that roof so fast I nearly fell, my heart racing all over again. Those prints were proof, physical, undeniable proof that what I'd experienced wasn't a hallucination or a panic attack or exhaustion playing tricks on me. Something had been on my RV, something that wasn't fully human, and it had left its mark. I thought about taking photos, documenting it, but then what? Show it to who? The police would think I was crazy, and honestly, I didn't want any record of this. I just wanted to forget it ever happened. I grabbed a rag and a bottle of cleaner from inside and scrubbed those prints away, working until my arms ached and there was nothing left but clean metal and the memory of what had been there. I hit the road by 9 a.m., took Highway 90 east toward San Antonio, then north to Austin. The drive should have been calming. Daylight, normal traffic, regular Texas landscape with billboards and rest stops and trucks hauling cattle. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every car that got too close might have one of those things behind the wheel. I stopped only once, at a busy truck stop outside San Antonio, and I practically ran inside to use the bathroom, checking over my shoulder the whole time. An older lady washing her hands gave me a concerned look. "You all right, honey?" she asked. I nodded, forced a smile. "Just tired. Long drive." She patted my arm. "Well, you be careful out there. Lot of weirdos on the road these days." If she only knew. I made it to Austin around 3 in the afternoon, and seeing the city skyline almost made me sob with relief. Simone lived in a newer apartment complex on the south side, one of those places with a gate and security cameras and a doorman. I'd never been so happy to see a gated community in my life. She was waiting outside when I pulled into the visitor parking area, and the second I got out, she wrapped me in a hug. "Mom, you look terrible. What happened?" I held on to her longer than I normally would, breathing in her familiar perfume, feeling her solid realness. "I had a really bad night camping. I don't want to talk about it yet. Can I just stay with you for a while? I'll park the RV in storage somewhere. I just need to not be in it." Simone got me settled in her guest room and made me tea, and I finally told her everything. I expected her to look at me like I'd lost my mind, but instead, she pulled out her laptop. "Mom, there are forums about this stuff. People who've had experiences in West Texas, around Big Bend and the border areas. Look," she showed me thread after thread, campers, hikers, truckers, all reporting similar things. People with wrong features, synchronized movements, filed teeth. Some called them hollow folks, some used other names. There were theories, everything from government experiments to ancient curses to dimensional rifts. None of it made sense, but knowing I wasn't alone, that other people had seen these things and survived, that helped somehow. Over the next few days, I started feeling more like myself. I put the RV in long-term storage and told Simone I'd probably sell it. Maybe go back to working part-time at a clinic, something normal and structured. But I couldn't sleep well. Every night, I'd wake up around 3 a.m., convinced I heard scratching under the bed or footsteps on the roof of Simone's apartment building. She suggested I talk to someone, a therapist maybe, and I probably should have. But what was I going to say? That I'd seen monsters in Texas and now I was afraid of the dark like a child? Instead, I just tried to push through it, told myself it would get better with time. Simone had to go to a work conference in Dallas for 3 days, and I insisted I'd be fine alone in her apartment. I wasn't fine. The second night she was gone, I woke up to that feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. My room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight through the curtains, and I lay there frozen, my eyes adjusting, scanning the shadows. Nothing, just furniture and my own paranoia. But then I heard it, tap 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 on the window. I was on the 4th floor. There was nothing outside that window except a sheer drop to the courtyard below. I forced myself to look, pulled back the curtain with trembling fingers. There was a face pressed against the glass, upside down, grinning at me with those pointed teeth. The same man from Seminole Canyon. He waved at me with those 6-fingered hands, and I screamed, stumbling backward and falling over the nightstand. By the time I'd scrambled to my feet and looked again, he was gone. I turned on every light in the apartment, checked every lock, and sat in the living room with a kitchen knife until dawn. When Simone came home the next day, I told her I'd seen him again, and this time, she looked scared too. "Mom, maybe they followed you somehow. Maybe you need to leave Austin, go somewhere completely different." But I was done running. I'd spent 4 months on the road trying to find myself after the divorce, trying to feel free, and instead I'd stumbled into something that had followed me home. That night, I packed up my things, bought a plane ticket to Simone's apartment in Portland where my sister lived, and left Texas for good. I never went back for the RV, just called the storage place and told them to sell it or scrap it. I didn't care. Some experiences you can't drive away from, some things get under your skin and stay there. I still see those faces sometimes when I close my eyes, still hear that tapping on windows that shouldn't be reachable. And I know now that there are parts of Texas where the rules are different, where things exist that shouldn't, and the only way to survive is to leave and never look back.